And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight in the Ideas Room. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we're here with you on a Saturday night. We had a handful of YouTube crisscross going on last night, and we seem to have worked that out of the system. So here we are. So you are going to get a double delight because you're basically going to get part one and part two together. And I'm still going to do questions.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that?
Looking forward to it.
Of course, in the second half of the program, we are going to take your questions. And Miss Olivia is putting those together now. So you can ask your questions even now, and she's going to read them out later.
Mm-hmm. I saved the questions from last night also.
Did you really?
Mm-hmm.
Look at you go. We'll be here all night.
I know.
Unbelievable. We went through some interesting things yesterday, and what I'll do is I'm going to actually present the entire two pieces here tonight. And there's a lot of deep, kind of powerful pieces to this X series, but welcoming everybody back for 2023 is delightful. And to see everyone here, a lot of familiar faces out there in the Ideas Room. I look forward to getting to your questions later. This is so interesting that we get into the LBJ Nixon piece, because this is not often covered when you get around the UFO file. People find themselves going back to Truman and Eisenhower and then kind of skipping ahead, maybe, Reagan and Clinton, and then they just jump, straight ahead from there. So that in-between section is very crucial, but there's not a lot known about it. Tonight, I'm going to shed a whole lot of light on what was happening with the UFO file under the guardianship of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who took over for President John F. Kennedy after the assassination in 1963. Of course, there's a lot of dicey factors involved with LBJ and that assassination that we're going to get into. Although,
understatement.
Exactly. But as I will also say, there's been a lot of, let's say, attribution of the assassination to this mastermind, LBJ, and it doesn't wash. The Central Intelligence Agency holds the central role, along with a group inside called X-Protect, which operates in that defense contractor UFO file corridor with the intelligence angle. That also needs to be brought out. So it is interesting because last night they didn't have a Speaker of the House yet, but now we have McCarthy as Speaker of the House. A lot of people didn't want him. I can definitely appreciate that. I did write a letter to him, which we publicize here, and it's still up, actually. I published it on Facebook, and I sent him a certified copy. And that called for the release of the JFK records, because they have the ability through a congressional hearing to mandate that go through. And that's what should happen. Those records are becoming more and more interesting, and they're getting more and more coverage. A lot of the things that we've put forward about Judge Napolitano's comments, which I think are very important in this context, because Napolitano knows Trump. And when Trump was, leaving the presidency, he explained to Napolitano, who was pressing him why he didn't release the JFK records, that he could not. And the conversation went. So I'm going to play that conversation tonight as well, because I think the fact that it's catching on is important, because what it tells us is there's still something that was left in those records, which is absolutely crucial. And that's why they've been such a political football here over the past 60 years. Count them, 60 years, generation upon generation. This is going back to grandparents and great-grandparents at this point. And for people who, have contacted me, who were just growing up around the time of the JFK assassination and gave some of those firsthand accounts, I think it's important to look back at that period in time and see how much policy in America shifted with President Kennedy's death, and also the deeper subtext that something else was in control. And, and you look at those people, and life went on, of course, but it was not admitted on the surface that this terrible thing had taken place. and that there were all these forces behind it. Instead, they blamed this lone nut and created a media image, and they did it concurrently. They kept using the formula in the 60s and into the 70s and even the 80s. And they refined the formula. They got really into plane crashes later. I noticed that seemed to be kind of the weapon of choice for the deep state at a certain point. But you're going to find in the Kennedy family a bizarre string of plane crashes as well, which makes you wonder, what was going on here. But by pursuing LBJ and Nixon, who are sandwiched on either end, really, you have the Kennedy presidency, and then you have LBJ taking over, and really, carte blanche. He comes in the last year of Kennedy's term, and he takes over, and then he runs, for president, and in 64, and he's running basically, unopposed in the Democratic Party because they have all the sympathy of the Kennedy assassination. And he trounces Barry Goldwater, who, although a very deep thinker and plays a role in the UFO file, was a very weak candidate. So it was very easy to trounce him. And you had LBJ having this carte blanche. And one of the interesting things that LBJ did was create the Great Society. And this was basically expanding the welfare state to such a point. Now, that's while getting us into the Vietnam War. And, a lot of people would go back to Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration saying, well, Vietnam really started there. It's very important to note that the Kennedy administration never had ground troops in Vietnam. They had advisors, they had special forces, but they never numbered more than 15,000. And when you compare that with the 500,000 people that LBJ sent in there, almost 60,000 of which didn't come back, it's a very different picture. So LBJ and Nixon really, creating this incredible boondoggle for the military-industrial complex and a disaster for our foreign policy. Kennedy had, with his own national security action memorandums before he died, included 1,000 troops to come back from Vietnam, and then he had assured that all of the troops were going to be out by 1965. So a very different approach going on there. Instead, what we get is LBJ goes in and does a false flag, and we get the Vietnam War out of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which even now historians, say, well, it didn't really happen. So we have a lot of history that's like that, and it's important for us to uncork it and to, show the full tapestry of what actually happened, and to, live in this reality that we've been, it's been a world of psyops. And one of the most kind of the deepest, I would say, has to do with the UFO file, and it's also one of the most important pieces that's behind that wall of secrecy, and we're going to get into that tonight. Before we go any further, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's how we stay in touch when things get wonky with YouTube or any of the social media. And I mentioned this last night when I was talking with Olivia during the show that one of the things that came out of the Twitter files, which I think are very lightweight in general, but are nonetheless a good sign in the grand scheme of things. But one of the things that was in there is how they would take accounts, and they wouldn't say we're censoring this guy or we're pulling this guy. They would say we're de-amplifying them. I think this is very important for us to understand how they think about free speech and the exchange of ideas, like we have here in the ideas room. They want to de-amplify our voice in this conversation. That's what they hope to do. If they can't get rid of it, they're going to just keep it under the algorithm so the people won't find it. But inevitably, they're going to lose. But that mentality shows just how weak the argument for control of free speech. And of course, in America, it's enshrined in the very Constitution. Free speech is the First Amendment. That's the first thing you have to deal with. And the tech companies, just don't like that, because in a free marketplace of ideas, this kind of martial woke philosophy is not going to hold up. But we've seen a lot of that activity, and you're going to be looking at a lot of special reports from me and what we're doing here in relation to what's happening, in 2023. And one of the things I've been trying to put forward as kind of the slogan for 2023 is no surrender. So it seems very much with things like the emergency programs, COVID emergency, this emergency authorization, emergency in Canada. It's the emergency powers that these people thrive on because they can't seem to get really above 35% of the actual vote total, unless it's a mail-in order election. So we have these types of things going on, and we need to understand that it's through emergency powers that they rule. So the more that we kind of lift the veil on the emergency powers, the continuity of government program, and things of this nature, the more their power goes away. And they'll be looking for more incidents to give them emergency powers. And let's not forget that, there's a lot of continuity of government in the period that we're looking at. The continuity of government and the deep events piece. If you go there between the JFK assassination and the Watergate incidents, we're talking about two deep events in history, as Professor Scott would say. And deep events are those things that we see happening, which it's where this covert side of the government sort of steps in, makes a policy change through a deep event, and then steps back out and leaves us all to deal with the rubble of the thing they just did while we have all these committees investigating. And they're like, well, finally, we just don't know who did it, and they put out a bunch of people like a board game, and it becomes a multiple choice video game for, who done it. And we've seen this with 9/11, with Watergate, Iran-Contra, the JFK assassination, the COVID crisis, the financial coup d'etat of 2008. There are all these different pieces. And it seems, you get a few people that are thrown out, and end up in prison or whatever. But in general, it's just the cost of doing business. There's a few companies that get fined, they were fined $3 billion, but they made $250 billion. So, that's just the cost of doing business. So that whole system needs to be switched up. And I think 2023 is a crucial year for doing this before the major 2024 presidential election comes on. And I have to say that, there's a lot of voices in alternative media talking about how the 2024 election isn't important, and how the presidency isn't important, and all these other things are important. That's just totally wrong. Fundamentally, what you need is a complete political body politic, as it were, and the head is very important. So the presidency is a crucial position, and we'll see that, through the presence and history of people like President Kennedy. This becomes a crucial fact. So who we have in there, just like we can see with Stepford Biden, it's a disaster for this country. And, with the omnibus bill and all this money to Ukraine and the World War III drums and all this kind of stuff, it's very important who's at the top of that. It's not the whole picture. It's not like the president can do it all himself, but he sets the tone and he moves the programs. And this is a very important position. So I do want us to focus a lot on the 2024 presidential election. And I don't think that we should blow it off and think, well, only local stuff matters or something like that. I don't want anything like that to catch on. I want us to be very focused on those high-level elections, because we can see they count. Mm-hmm. They make all the difference. All right, so I'm going to dive in here, and we'll take your questions in the second half. Miss Olivia, before I go. Hit me
Back
up.
and to the left says, Nixon and LBJ both left behind letters. Have any been revealed?
Well, I've revealed them both on this program. This is the interesting thing. And you probably heard about the Nixon and LBJ letters from watching the X-Series, because you're not going to hear about it anywhere else. So in this program, we're going to talk about the X-Letter that is sitting there at the LBJ library. And the attempt there is to blow things off. But it's a good question, because you're going to find that one of the key things that we have in the show are the stealth archives. And the stealth archives is a crucial factor for people to understand. So take, for example, the JFK records. We know they're there. I know they're there. You know they're there. The government knows they're there. And we know that they have some kind of important information. We think it's incriminating information. And, you know, when you look at that, you realize, oh, we're all aware of it, but we can't touch it. So they're basically stealth. They're there, but they're not there. And there's a whole kind of host of these, and the LBJ X-Letter is one. Now, the crucial thing about the LBJ X-Letter is that it comes out in June of 2023. There have been a lot of things, and I've done a lot of reporting around this letter, but I have it right here because it's included in tonight's show. But that X envelope is there. It was set up by LBJ to come out, and for all intents and purposes, it's one of those pieces like the Nixon time capsule, like the Eisenhower notes, and these things that are meant to come out and show the role of the people involved in UFO disclosure before UFO disclosure happens. So each president has to say, well, I did this and I did that, but they can't talk about it during their administration because of the nature of the deep state secrecy. But they do want to make sure for posterity that they're included. And it's also part of maybe a game that goes on in these power circles. So top secret, to be opened by the director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library, not earlier than 50 years from this date, June 26, 1973. If you move that up 50 years, that's this coming June 2023. And that's the actual note there. This is something that LBJ did, and everyone assumed, and that the spin on it has been like, oh, it was all about the fact that Nixon tried to prevent a peace plan in Vietnam and all the rest. Look, if LBJ had the really damning kind of information, he would have used it, and he would have helped out his Democratic comrade, Hubert Humphrey. So there was a game there of blackmail between LBJ and Nixon, and LBJ was saying, well, I have this and this and this on you, Nixon, and LBJ would say, I know you were involved in the Kennedy assassination. And this process goes on, and I'm going to reveal some very interesting quotes from some Nixon aides in relation to this, and also show how the battle between LBJ and Nixon is also indicated in the battle with Helms, the CIA director, and Nixon. These things are all interesting, but the piece that we don't get to see, very often people will say, well, there's a control file for this, there's a control file for that. We're coming into that awareness of how they've been able to use certain types of blackmail. But how about the blackmail around the UFO file? That's the key element that we're looking at here tonight. So it's going to become very important. There was a charade about opening the X envelope in 1994 after Nixon died. And supposedly the director at that time opened it on July 22nd, but they only released 2 pages, and they were all basically blacked out. And there's 75 pages of material in the X-Letter. So the X-Letter is going to become very important as we go into 2023, even though the CIA has tried to take it off the radar by saying, oh, it's just something that was already opened, or, they are kind of, they had to classify it for national security reasons. No, LBJ put it aside for that reason, knowing in 50 years he could release it. And the owner of the library, the director of the library knows that, the CIA knows it. So those files should come out, just like the JFK files should be available to us. Those stealth archives, fundamental point of view. But great question. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. Anything else?
That's it for now.
Okay,
Actually,
good.
you know what? I did want to bring this up. It's slightly off topic, but Timothy Guessing says Curtis LeMay denied Barry Goldwater access to the X material. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, that is really interesting because Goldwater, he was a very blunt Republican from Arizona, and a very honest guy. And he actually had a cordial relationship with JFK, even though they were going to run against each other in 1964. But years later, he recounted this question about when the UFOs were coming up. He decided to call up LeMay, who he knew, and said, look, the public and everybody else is saying you're hiding these UFO craft at, Wright Patterson. So what's the deal there? What's going on? And, should you let some people in to see it? Maybe we could put a group together. And he said that he knew, he'd known LeMay a long time. LeMay had never said a cross word to him, but LeMay freaked out and said, if you ever ask me that again, I'll never talk to you. And don't ever talk about what we have at Wright-Patterson. So, of course, Goldwater did come out and tell the public this. So, you have to understand the level of secrecy that they place on this. They consider it a bigger secret than the atomic bomb. So we have to keep that in mind. I've put forward on this program that this is due to the Apotheum effect around the UFO file. And this is a kind of physics that they are not able to control, that they've been working to monitor and want to be the leader in. So they've used that as a justification to hide what should be public, because we have a secrecy process that can handle things of this nature. And, there's a way to let it out and have the kind of the world be on board. But instead, what we have is a very schizophrenic situation where a very small group gets this information. And they've been, behind innovations in science and medicine and all these other things. Because if you look at it, that's how science works. There's one guy who has this great innovation, and the other scientists jump on that and move forward. Well, if you're keeping it all in this private corridor of aerospace contractors and all the rest, then they get to divvy those secrets out where they want to, and they get to make the advances, and the culture is left in the dark. So you have a very upside down civilization right now. And it goes to the heart of this battle over the UFO file. And there's a sort of a key divide during the LBJ Nixon period, when LBJ is handing off the presidency to Nixon, who wins it in 1968 after LBJ bows out. And so we're going to get into some of those precedents tonight. What's interesting, if you look at the precedent of a president not running for a second term, it does not happen. So when LBJ announces in March of 1968, I'm not going to run, it's like resigning, which Nixon will do 6 years later. These are things that don't happen in the run of typical world leadership and presidency in America. And the fact that he wouldn't run is very telling, because he announces that in March. 5 days later, MLK is assassinated. 2 months after that, RFK is assassinated, who's running for the presidency and is running against LBJ. And, LBJ in those early primaries of 1968 shows incredible weakness because of the Vietnam War. And, Eugene McCarthy is a senator from Oregon who's running against him. And, it's kind of absurd what's going on there, where, he just doesn't have any support, no base. And so he was actually from Minnesota. But what's interesting to me is that once Kennedy, who had really held off on running against and had tried to sort of stay as the loyal Democrat, even though he understood the various crimes of LBJ, he didn't think he could step in there and just take the presidency away from them. But once, the first primary went down and McCarthy almost beat LBJ, Bobby Kennedy decides, I can actually do this. And he makes the move to jump in. He doesn't have that network that they had in 1960. He basically is on a wing and a prayer. But the Kennedys have a lot of money and a lot of political influence. And Johnson instantly realizes, well, obviously they're not going to let Bobby Kennedy into the White House, because even John F. Kennedy said about Bobby Kennedy that, he was a cop at heart, and that, he'd give his own mother a traffic ticket and things of this nature. So he just had such a sense of law and order, and he was such a justice officer that if he got in as the president, that he would investigate his own brother's death. This is what Johnson was aware of. And what he decided to do was step out, because he said, I can't be the recipient of, 2 Kennedy assassinations for the next round of the presidency. This is not going to work. I have to get out of this. And as soon as he gets out, the assassinations can happen smoothly. And the deep state actually gets the candidate that they want, which is Richard Nixon, who they also wanted in 1960. And weren't able to get because of the long arm of the influence of the Kennedys, even though it was an incredibly close election. And the 60 election comes up a couple of times here tonight, and we're going to find the UFO file figures in the middle of it, along with a very important and often overlooked character in the middle of all this, someone named Lloyd Berkner. And Berkner is key on the UFO file. He's key on Antarctica. He's key for particle collider acceleration, which is the setup of the CERN Hadron Particle Collider. This guy is off the charts. And we're also going to find out tonight the kind of TKO of the whole thing, the denouement of the introduction of Berkner, is that he is the person that Kennedy is going to meet at the Dallas Trade Mart and do a speech with on the way to the Trade Mart. He is assassinated, so the speech doesn't happen. And a lot of weird things about the speech that he didn't give. A lot of things that may have been revealed there because of the level of who we're talking about with Berkner and Kennedy. So we're going to get into that as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 142. We're going deep tonight. It is the LBJ Nixon UFO file battle. We'll take your questions in the second half of the program. And what I'm going to do now is just give you a little overview on Berkner, and then we're going to see how he was kind of used as a tool between all of these presidents. And this gets us right to the heart of the UFO file, because we're going to find Berkner working on the Robertson panel, which is a very public exercise in the UFO file that takes place in 1952.
1968 Camaro SS says, Watergate seems like a college prank compared to what we have going on today.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But it's also interesting about Watergate is it sets a tone for secret power and the battle over secret power. And it also sets a tone as a deep event for something that happens that has one explanation in public, but the deeper explanation is much more important and was never revealed to the public. That's another piece, and Watergate certainly fits into that. You really think all of that was over a call girl list that was in the Democratic National Headquarters in the DNC? I don't think so. No, there are much deeper reasons for it, and just like with 9/11, we find there's a whole involvement of this layer of intelligence and deep state operatives. And what's fascinating is this is something that Professor Scott points out, and I often, suggest his work. And it's interesting too, because Professor Scott, coming from the left coast and being basically a left-wing, on the political spectrum, certainly on the left, but he's somebody who understands the deep state and has always called out their activities. And so the true left will do that. And you don't find that, unfortunately, even with the best researchers now, they've all gone Trump crazy. But even when the CIA was going after Trump, Professor Scott realized, this is the deep state trying to work against the presidency again. And so whether or not people were in favor of Trump, you can't have the CIA targeting a president to remove him, just like you can't have the CIA and the deep state raiding an ex-president to try to remove him as a candidate for 2024. So, we need to draw the lines here, whether you're on the right or the left, about what, we expect from that power center and unconstitutional criminal activity about, targeting a political figure while you're the controlling party, the way Stepford Biden's doing right now is, this is just unacceptable. And so we can see all of these incidents resonate and echo through time. But one of the things that Professor Scott showed us in relation to these deep events as we go through them, the Kennedy assassination and Watergate, and, leading all the way up to the COVID deep event, there's always a continuity of government player involved. And this is very important because the system of the continuity of government, it comes up tonight as well, but it operates in such secrecy because of the nature of the work that they do. That is, they need to survive, have the country survive in the event, it used to be of a nuclear war, but now it's any emergency. So there's a whole infrastructure there built out, underground networks, infrastructure, technology, the whole bit that operates as a separate government. So it's very strange that in incidents like Watergate, you have John Dean, who was just working with the emergency preparedness COG network. In the JFK assassination, you have Winston Scott as the Secret Service lead setting up the Dallas trip, and he's using the COG Doomsday radio communications network. And of course in 9/11 and so on. So there's an element of this that needs to come to the public fore and be part of the public discussion, no matter how secret the activity. Just like when you get to the UFO file, it seems that the secrecy breeds more and more criminal activity. So that's the kind of a key thread that comes up through all of these. Now, Berkner is very interesting because I often talk about X-Share and X-Protect. The X-Protect group is secrecy at all costs, and they will, sort of people who are coming forward with information around the UFO file will get discredited. They will get, basically painted as either a lunatic or whatever it would happen to be. And the worst case scenario is when they couldn't do that with people like Morris Jessup, they just kill them. And so X-Protect has that reputation and operates in a very unusual way, so that when we get around things like the Men in Black reports that go through the UFO file, we're dealing with the X-Protect element there. That's a good fingerprint for who this group is and the way that they act, and also the strangeness that's involved there with the agency. Sometimes I call that aspect the astral agency. But there's a good amount of supporting information about this over, several decades. Now, when we look at the X-Share group, we're looking at people like President Kennedy, Thomas Townsend Brown, leading scientist, who is along this lines, Oppenheimer. These are people who want to share these advances with the public and want to move the culture in a different direction. So this becomes very important when we consider the mentalities. I think with Berkner, we're looking at somebody who was right down the middle, and that he realized he had to work with X-Protect, and he was mostly on the X-Share side, because I can see later he's targeted as being someone who says, we should have a strong defense, but he doesn't want offensive capabilities for nuclear arms and things like that. So he's more with the Oppenheimer crowd. That tends to be a real line in the sand about who is X-Share and who is X-Protect. The X-Protect people, tend to be from that really hardcore neocon wing that you see operating in military circles with a real martial philosophy. But Berkner is operating very, very deep. Here's a guy who at the age of 14 is so advanced that he's doing his own radio station. And we're talking about maybe 1920. And then he's spotted early on, and he goes with Admiral Byrd to Antarctica when he's 22 years old and sets up radio communication stations. He's so good, and actually, it's interesting because Byrd thinks so much of him that he will end up naming an island after him. And what's interesting, and I don't think I mentioned this.
In Antarctica.
Yeah, in Antarctica, yes. But what's interesting is also he names a submerged bank after him, and they call it the Berkner Bank. I find this very interesting because there we have, that whole thing about land rising, and he's naming this thing which is under the surface but rising. But I think that Berkner really is somebody on the Robertson panel, and he's there to, the whole Robertson panel is an exercise in 1952 by the Central Intelligence Agency to recruit these scientists to, on the surface, debunk the whole UFO thing, but underneath to get together to meet to actually study it. And he had worked and been the special assistant to Vannevar Bush. And we know Vannevar Bush held the UFO file. He was the one in charge of it through 3 administrations. So, we also know that John Trump, Trump's uncle, was Vannevar Bush's protege. So, we start to understand things like Space Force and things of this nature a little bit better. Here's a quote from Berkner. By the way, Berkner interacts with JFK and with LBJ and Nixon. They all have a series of meetings and letters. And he's going to come up, as I said, very important way when we come to the whole trademark part of the conversation. Quote, Lloyd Berkner, scientist, "We have been plunged into a race for the conquest of outer space. As a reason for this undertaking, some look to the new and exciting scientific discoveries which are certain to be made. Others feel the challenge to transport man beyond frontiers he scarcely dared to dream until now. But at present, the most impelling reason for our effort has been the international political situation, which demands that we demonstrate our technological capabilities if we are to maintain our position of leadership. For all of these reasons, we have embarked on a complex and costly adventure. In the purpose of this report to clarify the goals, the missions, and the costs of this effort for the foreseeable future, particularly regard to the Man in Space program." Berkner is somebody who is instrumental in setting up of NASA. He's somebody who there's deep steganography with, and he had a rank of Rear Admiral. Interestingly enough, he's put in charge of all these different scientific programs for which he's not qualified. This is very important because it shows someone politically maneuvering him into position, and that's going to be important as well. Just a sideshow on his steganography. This is something called Saving City X. Let's just give you an idea what that is. Saving City X, Planners, Citizens, and the Culture of Civil Defense, 1950 to 1964. And it's a program that is designed by Berkner for how a city would survive a nuclear attack. And he does it with Robert Oppenheimer. Now, in the side of this report, Berkner spoke out against the military's opposition to civil defense. This is April 1952, and I want you to keep the fact that in 1952, he's working on what? The Robertson panel for the UFO file. He decried military secrecy for keeping knowledge out of the hands of the people and lamented the military's increasing influence upon scientific and technological research. Sounds a lot like X-Share to me. Now, he says, since the military now sponsor a very substantial proportion of American research and development effort, they are in a position to limit the application of new ideas for obvious military applications. Through the conclusions of this project, which was called Project East River, and it was a whole civil defense setup for what would happen and how would a community work during a nuclear attack. The City X program looks suspiciously like well-calibrated, unified social control campaigns to convince Americans that they could survive a nuclear attack. There were people like Berkner who saw them as the first real government-endorsed public education programs dealing with the effects of the bomb. It was to them better to give the public some information and hope than none at all. Though City X did send clearly a false message that cities would survive a nuclear attack, some of its planners did not devise it with a deliberate propaganda device. So he's very interesting. He's in the real deep inner circles, and I think we get a hint of that struggle, which I think people like Truman and Eisenhower were involved with. And this comes directly into that. What do we do with the UFO file? When we get to LBJ, we're going to find out he's working very deeply around NASA and the whole space program aspect. He cozies up to all the funding around NASA and the space program. And he sets a program up in 1960 through the Senate to investigate UFOs. It's never talked about in relation to LBJ. I'm not sure why. And I'm not even going to guess, but maybe people just haven't run across it or didn't think it was substantial enough effort. But I'm going to put it on the record tonight that LBJ in 1960 called for a UFO investigation in the Senate. And we also are going to look at his relationship with James McDonald, and James McDonald being one of those really hardcore UFO researchers who ends up suicided, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. deep here tonight on LBJ and Nixon and the UFO file. And we're giving you some background here, which is somebody who's very important through all this. And that is Lloyd Berkner. And we're going to find him shoulder to shoulder with people like Admiral Byrd, who blazed a trail to Antarctica. And we're going to find that trail to Antarctica actually crisscrosses in Dealey Plaza, strangely enough. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. I'm going to remind you here, especially if you're new to the program, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch because we know we can't depend on the social media channels, although we're going to use them as much as we can. But, we've just had incredible kind of social censorship, social media censorship going on. So make sure that you do that. It's a free newsletter, and it basically tells you the incredible shows, events, documentaries, and interviews and X-Series episodes that we have coming up for you in January and February and throughout the year. So make sure that you stand up and be counted on that. Okay. Now, what's interesting, I'm going to see what is kind of crucial on this. I think that we need to jump now to LBJ and this piece. Now, remember the speech we just heard from Berkner saying, hey, we need to be kind of more open about these things and deal with man in space and all this kind of stuff. Well, here's a speech, and it's in it's actually in a Jim Marrs book, but it's a speech that he quotes LBJ in 1958. It's a crucial year. The Rise of the Fourth Reich, fantastic book by Jim Marrs, who was on this program many times, and I had many long and entertaining conversations with before he passed away. And I'll tell you, there's a big void in solid journalism that can move in these circles when we lost Jim Marrs, because he was able to do that with a kind of effortless way that he could do it. And because I think he'd been around so long, doing this kind of deep dives. And, so he was very comfortable. He was famous, for his JFK assassination research, but he went into the bushes. He went into 9/11. He went into the UFO file. There's actually a book called Alien Agenda, which is an early Marrs book, but it shows his connection with the UFO file. And, we were able to get him to come to the Secret Space Program conference. That was maybe 7 years ago. And so it's definitely a thrill there. Okay. Now, in talking about the Robertson panel, we've got Lloyd Berkner as somebody who's publicly on it. But behind the scenes, we know that there was some group that was involved around this whole majestic idea, and Vannevar Bush being identified as the leader of that group. We have independent confirmation of that. But Berkner is a part of that whole MJ-12, the legitimate MJ-12 scenario. So Marrs is talking about it here, and he says the agenda of this control group, which is basically MJ-12, may have been best expressed by Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who, speaking to the Senate Democratic Caucus on January 7th, 1958. Now think about that. That is, if you look at it, January 7th, now some 65 years ago today. Quote, control of space means control of the world. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause droughts and flood, to change the tides, raise the level of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change the climate so frigid to frigid. There is something more powerful than the ultimate weapon. That is the ultimate position, the position of the total control over Earth that lies somewhere in outer space. Think of the language that Johnson is using. And if there is an ultimate position, then our national goal and the goal of all free men must be to win and hold that position. Now, Johnson, who in 1954 became the youngest Senate Majority Leader in U.S. history, was in a position to serve those both in the military and the corporations. And you might note that George W. Bush also made some very militaristic statements in relation to space. And someone in this whole mix convinced Trump that in order to get the Space Force, he was going to have to use that kind of militaristic language. In fact, the creation of our space program clearly specifies through President Kennedy and Eisenhower that our exploration into space is to be peaceful and scientific in nature and is not to be military. And we, in fact, got a number of nations to sign on with us, to be on the same page on that. We're not going to put weapons in space. Well, suddenly a warfighting domain is announced. And, we've had 50 years where there's been no manned missions anywhere. There's been nothing to the moon since 1972. Well, how do you account for that? What have they been doing in between? Obviously, putting together a weapons infrastructure. And what LBJ is suggesting in 1958 is we can control the ground. This is very important because very often we think of space, you think of exploration or whatever it happens to be. But literally, the idea is we can go up there in space and control everything on planet Earth. And we see more and more of this kind of neocon mentality in space. And they've been deep into it. So, when we've heard things come up and they attach the UFO office and the UFO threat thing to the National Defense Authorization Act in 2023, and the senators who do it, Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, the Democrat and the Republican Marco Rubio, and others, those people are creating the machinery for this behind the scenes piece to say, oh, look, there's a UFO threat. They're after us and we need all your money to defend ourselves against it. And then in essence, take the UFO aspect and make it into another kind of enemy of war. Now, there's so many deep pieces to the UFO file. The whole idea of off-world visitors, of course, but our own advanced technology, ancient advanced technology as well, and all the things that are hidden there, the X technology in the UFO file. So before we take any kind of UFO threat thing on board, we need to understand where this is coming from. But whose speech, who gave this speech, and where is he coming from? Well, that was LBJ, who, as Senate Majority Leader, wielded incredible power. Just ask Chuck Schumer, or we certainly have had powerful Senate Majority Leaders in the past. So that's not a normal position, when we look at it. It's basically like Speaker of the House. It's not just that he was another senator and he got in. The Majority Leader is making all kinds of deals and things in the background. One of the deals that LBJ makes is to be on the Appropriations Committee with his friend, Senator Harry Byrd, who is the brother of Admiral Byrd, who has gone to Antarctica and all the rest. And one of the things that they do is they control all the funding, and they really jack up the spending for NASA and all the rest of it. They want to be right in the heart of that. The nickname for LBJ before he became JFK's VP was Senator NASA. So that's what he was known for. He was always against civil rights bills and things like that, which is really interesting that he becomes, in the 60s, the civil rights guy, the big promoter of the Kennedy policies that didn't come through. But I think another thing we want to know about LBJ's presidency is that when he was creating programs like HUD, things of this nature, which are ostensibly to, kind of increase social programs, create a great society, make sure people in the lower classes and the ghettos are getting an uplift and all this stuff. But what we find out later is that HUD and a number of these agencies become this kind of black budget market ground, and they will become the vehicles through which all of this military and secret money will funnel through. That's an important thing for us to keep in mind. In fact, LBJ's Great Society, which buys him a lot of votes and distracts from Vietnam, will be used as a great boondoggle in the background as all this money shows up for certain types of allocations and disappears into this black hole of them building what? Space operations becomes a very likely answer for this. And I'm going to show you why. But I want to go into Johnson here and his role with JFK that piece. Then we'll go into the Nixon Kennedy piece, and then bring Berkner and Byrd into the heart of it, now that we've met them. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep tonight on the Nixon LBJ UFO file battle. That runs deep in the government, and it's something that needs to be paid attention to and brought forward, because there's a lot of deep state research that I think is really good about programs, even around the Kennedy assassination, etc. But unfortunately, they leave out this aerospace piece, and the UFO file aerospace piece around the deep state operations is crucial. And when you leave that out, you're leaving out a big reason for a lot of the, for why these things are done in the first place. So we have a gap there that I've pointed out before, which is that the deep state researchers are very good and understand the government very well. The UFO researchers don't. We've seen that very clearly, and a lot of them have been very disappointing in signing on with government propaganda programs like To the Stars Academy, for example, and the whole Elizondo semi-van, all that stuff, which were all CIA people on record, and coming forward and creating this whole, UFOs as a threat, and like, hey, look, the Tic Tac video, and we just discovered UFOs in 2017. That whole thing that we've reported on, and really, I think, pushed back a lot of this UFO threat narrative. But the people in the UFO field were so starved out by the government that the field itself had become really adrift. And I think when the CIA rolled in 2017, the idea was, hey, we'll publicly come out and do this whole thing, and those people will be so decimated it won't matter, because they won't have that kind of following or whatever. And so there was no resistance when this whole thing happened. And then you saw the media kind of giddily get on board and say, hey, we're reporting on UFOs. Look how transparent we are. And I want to make a great point also about 2023. I've said that the slogan we should have is no surrender. The other thing I think that we should look for is potency. Potency becomes very important. So, for example, when we see things like, Megyn Kelly on Fox, former Fox News Megyn Kelly coming out and doing her show now, and doing it on YouTube, right? They used to be in these places. Now they have to come directly into YouTube. But it's interesting to me because she will cover something important like the UFO file, but she'll have somebody like, these CIA cutouts on the show giving her the background on it. Tucker Carlson, the same thing. You get the same thing. So Tucker Carlson in December did a kind of interesting report. It didn't actually get deep into it. He just had a kind of a thin veneer on top that, yeah, the CIA was involved in the JFK assassination. They weren't really working with anything except to say that they had some kind of a whistleblower who was giving them that information. Well, I'm all in favor of that stuff coming out, but I also feel like, the nature of this needs to be explored on a deeper level, and that we can't just have kind of frilly headlines that don't really go deep just because you want ratings, or just because you think, you realize through market research that the public is interested in this. You need to give them the actual full-on details. I think the Twitter files is another thing like that. This is very superficial stuff. Where's the deep stuff? You certainly have it. Musk certainly has it. So we have to kind of become aware of who we're dealing with. And again, with Musk, you're dealing with extegonography in space. So we're right back where we started with this. So I think we need to get very real. So potency and the delivery of real deep reporting, the kind of dark journalism that I'm trying to do and what we've tried to bring out in the work of others that we've had on this program, those are the things that we need to get behind. And I think we need to really shun, the glossier, fluffier stuff. I don't think that that's where it's at. And I think, if you're sitting on top of this $300 million podcast or something like that, it's not the same thing. You have to be able to, and these things all have their place, but you have to be able to deliver the actual message around it, unfiltered. You have to deliver the truth as you've found it. So, when you're dealing with the UFO file, you can't have a bunch of intelligence people come on as your guests and give you the narrative on it. That's not reporting. And then afterwards, you're like, see, we're so edgy. We report on UFOs. This is a deep thing. So if those people are going to go into it, one, they should study it and understand the 7-8 decades worth of research around it. And two, the CIA should be completely off limits in terms of where you would go to get your information from it. I think that's pretty fair. So look for that potency, promote that potency, support that in 2023, and that's where we're going to get some answers going.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Miss
Right.
Olivia.
Otherwise, it's like the obrification of the topic.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And we've had enough of that. So, I'm all for Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly getting into the topic, but in order to do it correctly, it can't just be something they hit on once a month,
Oh yeah, it becomes like a fluff line,
mm-hmm.
For them. And it's not that people like that can't do good reporting. I'm not saying that. But you have to realize that when you're working for Fox News or CNN or something, you're working for the man. And it's very hard to get deep, potent research. And I think the only thing worse than, a whole lie is half a truth. And so this bothers me. The superficial kind of astroturfing of it bothers me. And we've seen a lot of that. And I think the way to get through it is to think about this concept of potency. How potent is the reporting on this thing? Are they, cutting through, and are they not using intelligence sources? That's also important, because intelligence sources are the masters, especially the counterintelligence people that they roll out. They are the masters of disinformation propaganda. And that comes up tonight as well as we get into it. And so what I'm going to do is jump to the Kennedy section now. Before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Sarah Ajagu wanted to know, was there a relationship between Berkner and Alan Dulles?
Oh yeah, Dulles is one of the people who wanted him on that Robertson panel. And it's interesting because I think the CIA thought they could use him. But what's interesting that I found recently in a document, which was declassified, was that originally the CIA wanted to insist on hiding their role in the Robertson panel. It leaked out and people became familiar with the idea that this is just a CIA whitewash years later. But at the time, it was supposed to be, here are these independent scientists, kind of moving the football on this thing and saying, oh, that flying saucer craze, that's nothing. There's nothing there. It's just the planet Venus, that kind of thing. So it's the original whitewash. And then when it doesn't work, that's when Blue Book kicks in and they seem like they're a little more serious about making it happen. But their thing becomes a whitewash as well. So the CIA, what their job at that point was to keep all of this information that they were developing around the UFO file hidden so they could keep developing it, not share it, and to misdirect the public into, either total denial or maybe really even promotion of some of the wilder stuff that you saw in the 50s. They may have even helped with the whole Venusian invasion, as it were. But yes, it's a very interesting point. When we talk about LBJ and JFK, I'm going to do this back to front. So LBJ at the end of his life is kind of this miserable person. And this is from a lot of different sources. He's depressed. And there are sources that say he's depressed over his role in the JFK assassination. And again, I would specify that I don't think that he's the mastermind of the JFK assassination, but I think he knew what was coming in and he signed up to be the replacement big time. I'm also going to show you what might have been the dry run for the assassination even before the JFK assumed the presidency. But LBJ in 1973 dies of a heart attack. For the year or two before that, he gives weird interviews where he lets out little truths about the fact that he didn't believe Oswald was involved. He didn't believe the Warren Commission, things like that. But he deteriorates a little so that by the end of his life, a lot of his friends don't even recognize it's him. He's definitely, this is where he ends up. And if you think about the time he assumed the presidency from Kennedy, it's basically around 9 years that he lives out being president, and he becomes the president that people do remember for these social programs, but he was so hated for Vietnam that this idea of him, that he had in his own mind that he would be this incredible hero and all this, it works out quite differently. He satisfies the deep state masters, as it were. But it's interesting to me that even Peter Dale Scott says that at a certain point, the deep state turns against LBJ. I think they have a tendency to do this, that they have even less respect for the puppets that they put in than they do for the people who resist them. And this
wow,
gets us,
that's deep.
Yeah, it gets us into a position. LBJ and RFK are in a weird position when the assassination of President Kennedy happens, because they have an open hostility to each other, and Bobby's from the beginning tried to have him off the ticket, first of all, but second of all, once he's on that ticket, tries to minimize his position and ultimately remove him from the ticket for the 64 run, which is happening. And so what's going to happen in 1964, according to rock solid sources, including Kennedy's secretary and other friends of Kennedy, is that he's planning to dump Johnson off the ticket for 1964. And it's floated even in the Dallas newspaper the day before LBJ and JFK, ride through Dealey Plaza, that he's going to be dumped from the ticket. And Nixon, who just happens to be in town for Pepsi Cola, he gives a press conference and he says, "Oh, there's no way LBJ will be on that ticket in 1964." So it's out there, At the same time, he's being investigated by a Senate committee for bribes, and one of his major henchmen, Billy Celestes, his business partner, is going to jail. Now, Celestes, it's very important to note, in 1984, 11 years after LBJ's dead, will go before a grand jury and give the following testimony, that he is aware of the murders of LBJ, and he lists a number of them, and right in the middle of that list is John F. Kennedy. So Celestes wanted to go on the record with this, and this became so explosive. Now, Douglas Caddy was involved in speaking with Celestes in this period, and in my interview with Caddy, where he talks about JFK and the UFO file and how E. Howard Hunt told him privately that JFK was assassinated because of his desire to share the UFO file, we get kind of a deeper insight into the Celestes piece. But what happens with Celestes is eventually a director from the UK named Nigel Turner, who has done this kind of running series about Kennedy's assassination, and with very good and deep dives into it, in the 80s and 90s. In 2003, he comes out with something called The Guilty Men, which is an incredible, scathing sort of expose of LBJ, and the History Channel, to their credit, runs it because they've done work with him in the past. And the History Channel gets beat up terribly, and the people who are suing them are Bill Clinton, Lady Bird Johnson, and so many people from across the spectrum join in on this thing to get it out of circulation, and they succeed in doing that. It only ran once, and then it was removed. And a number of people, I've been able to, I have a copy of it, and there are some people, there's kind of a little network of people who kept that one. But in there, they talk about, some serious evidence against LBJ for that period from 1948 to 1963. But one of the things that I think is crucial that's in there is the piece about Billy Celestes. So even though this happens in 1984, it takes 20 years to get out there. And when it hits that Billy Celestes, who was his partner, says that he was involved in the JFK assassination, that's a big piece. Well, 4 years later, this E. Howard Hunt, who is the same person who was told JFK was killed over the UFO file, he'll say on the record to his son, well, JFK was assassinated, and it was LBJ and corrupt members of the CIA. So he also puts him, he puts him in a higher position. But I think ultimately, when you look at all these different things, what you see is that incredible kind of setup for the JFK assassination that comes about through the Central Intelligence Agency needs the replacement. They need their guy. And so for his part, LBJ is aware of this, and he is, his own future is very much, it's important to realize with LBJ that he is going to prison and he's going to be off the ticket in 64. Those are the two futures for him when the car takes a big turn onto Elm Street. Now, that's where he's headed. Let's go back in time to a strange thing, which I don't think is talked about very often. And that's an early trip to Dallas before he becomes president. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And they go right through. They go Love Field, and they do something that's very similar in trajectory to, in fact, the assassination. I'm going to run through that now. As I do, Miss Olivia, what you got up?
Devlin Liam McGregor says LBJ, unannounced and unexpected, visited James Forrestal shortly before he was suicided. Any thoughts?
Well, he has a weird history of visiting people in the hospital. There he is visiting Nixon in the hospital. He will be, in fact, the last person who sees Forrestal before Forrestal will end it all. I think there's a lot in his activities in relation to this. And, I think here he is in 1960 during the JFK and Nixon battle. And he's the VP candidate, of course, but he's visiting Nixon. And this is like a weird passive aggressive thing, but there might also be a scare here that he's giving to Kennedy, which is keep me on the ticket. Don't monkey around, because I can give all this damning information that I have on you to your opponent, Nixon, which was raised as a potential on a couple of different occasions. And I think the way that LBJ gets on that ticket, we've seen through Kennedy's secretary and others, Evelyn Lincoln, that he blackmails himself onto the ticket. Interestingly enough, I think people who look at that still understand that Kennedy kind of needed LBJ because they needed to carry Texas in order to win. This is a tight election. So it's a weird thing. It's kind of like the deal with the devil to get in. But in any case, LBJ wants to get and be on that ticket, and he's willing to do anything in order to do it. And the Kennedys themselves had decided we're not going to do this. And so there is an incident that's recounted in history that we have several good sources for, where LBJ lays it out with the help of his friend J. Edgar Hoover that he's going to be on the ticket, or Kennedy is basically going to go down because of some things in Kennedy's background in relation to affairs and things of this nature. Now, and I think one of the interesting things that I recall from this is Evelyn Lincoln saying she's there in the hotel room with them after they get this news, and they're just sitting there, Robert and JFK, after LBJ has attempted this, and they're looking off into space, being like, how do we handle it? What are we going to do? And that they're in that room for hours, working it out, completely silent. But ultimately, LBJ lands himself on the ticket. And I do think that it's without a doubt that he needed to be on the ticket because they wouldn't have carried Texas. And that was crucial in an election like that, really, where it was separated by less than 100,000 votes. So they won just by, a scant number. And considering all the effort they put into it, it's quite miraculous. Most people attribute the win on the Kennedy side to the debates where Kennedy came out on television and basically blew away Nixon with his, kind of very
tan good looks,
and studied background on it. Yeah, what do you got? You're laughing there.
Gary Smith says, why did Robert Caro omit these details, re LBJ?
This is very strange. Look, Caro's whole volumes on LBJ don't mention Billy Celestes. It's absurd. It's the arc absurd. How can you not mention it? But I do find that this happens. This is the censoring that they need. So they'll be like, oh, you wouldn't believe this guy. He had affairs. He did drugs. He did all this stuff. So they'll lay out all this stuff that's safe to say, well, what, you can't do anything about that. But the Billy Celestes thing suggests that he was illegitimate and a criminal. That's different. So, we have to understand to separate what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say. But because of that, I think a lot of Caro's work on the biography side just needs to be scrapped. Like a lot of these people that they have come out and talk about JFK, Michael Beschloss and all these guys, basically they're working off a script and they have to say, they'll get thrown out of that whole, establishment of the Council on Foreign Relations and the whole CFR network. They'll never be invited to cocktail parties. They'll never be able to go on CNN if they tell the truth. So this is the nature of what we have. This is why we desperately need an important, potent independent media. And that's what we're putting forward with the reports that we do. But this is what's necessary. And this is the thing that we need to support across the board for anyone who's doing it. And, it's so important because otherwise the information is so manipulated on that establishment level. And they think their idea of being transparent is saying, hey, how about Jeffrey Epstein and Orgy Island? Well, if you don't go into the deeper levels of what Epstein represents, then it's just a salacious story. And if you don't investigate how he was killed and all the rest, then, this is, where's the client list? This is often said. So, sure, this is the thing on top. As I said, it's important, to understand for the public to understand that this guy was a creep, but let's go a little bit deeper, creep for who? What about the scientific side? What about eugenics? What about Atlantis? That's all. They're all there wide open in the Maxwell Epstein situation. That's the kind of thing, which I think really can shake things up, and we can get to deep places with that. Okay. Now, the trip to Dallas before the historic trip to Dallas. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight, LBJ and Nixon and the battle over the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of this program coming up in about a half hour. I'm good. And of course, we had fun joining you last night, but we had all kinds of YouTube hijinks going on. And then the final edition of that, when it was done, started in the middle or something. So here we are, just a whole fresh new kind of license on all this. And I want to remind you, especially if you're new, but if you haven't already, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter that keeps you posted on everything that we're doing coming up and the very important shows, events, documentaries, interviews that you won't believe that are coming up here January, February, and March. And for the rest of 2023, it's going to be off the charts. Make sure you're in the know and hear it first. And of course, if you're there and you want to support our show and subscribe to it, you get the episodes directly in your inbox. Go ahead and sign up there as well. And that's really the best way to keep in touch. And we've talked about other networks for things, and I've put a few things on Telegram, a few things on Rumble here and there, and we'll continue to do more of that and build it up over time. But we're still doing things directly here on the website and through YouTube. So that's you're going to find us here on Friday nights. Usually tonight it's Saturday. What do you got there?
Sorry, I gotta get somebody out of here. And you're gone.
That's the kind of cosmic bouncer there. Olivia is doing it. Okay. The Forgotten Dallas Motorcade. It's very interesting, and I think gives us a hint of what's happening in relation to eventual historic events. This is Campaign 60, the Dallas Morning News. And there's a point here in the fall where LBJ and JFK will go to Dallas. And it's kind of fascinating too, because I think it's not often spoken about, but the parade route that is set up by the mayor and all the rest must utilize aspects of this original trip, which I find interesting as well. And they may have said, well, we might be able to use this setup because not that everyone was in on the JFK assassination, but we know that the mayor of Dallas was Earl Cabell, who was the brother of General Charles Cabell, who was a CIA deputy director that had been fired with Dulles over the attempted invasion of Cuba. They were trying to pressure Kennedy into. Now, that's important because the files that Trump let out indicated clearly, and we found out on the record, what all those researchers wanted to know all this time, which was the mayor, because of his brother's association, working with the CIA? And he actually, in fact, was a CIA agent. So that's very important. So the person who is, hosting the Kennedys is a CIA agent. So when he leads him through Dallas on that motorcade, it's the CIA that's doing it. And the other person who was in charge of mapping that out was the Secret Service agent, Winston Lawson, who, as I said, many researchers, Professor Scott and others, have called him out for lying in his testimony about things like, oh yeah, there were too many windows to cover, so we, this type of thing, as to his excuse for why the Texas School Book Depository was just wide open, and they had taken Kennedy in this very unusual turn and slowed the car down to some 11 miles an hour. To do that, the Secret Service has rules against doing that. And this is the thing that Fletcher Prouty brought out as somebody who would have been involved and had been involved in the security. For example, when Eisenhower went to Mexico City, he understood that something was strange about what they had done, and also that they had taken the Secret Service off of the back of the limousine. So let's set the scene now. So the blackmail thing has happened, and LBJ is on the ticket. For better or for worse, he's on. And so Kennedy's in it to win it in the fall of 1960, and he's going to beat Richard Nixon. But at this stage, Nixon actually has the advantage in the polls. And, we're coming out of the Eisenhower era, so he has that glow. Although Nixon has always had kind of a weird track record and almost got thrown off of the Eisenhower ticket. And there's the whole Checkers speech and all this stuff back there. So the public is leaning towards him because he's a conservative, safe choice. And Kennedy still represents the unknown. And he's very young.
And he's Catholic.
And he's Catholic, yes. So I'd say there's a few things. And also the fact that his own party struggled to elect him and give him the nomination because of a lot of these reasons. A lot of the old guard wanted to run Adlai Stevenson again. I kid you not. And those were the heavies in the party, like Eleanor Roosevelt. They were very opposed to Kennedy. And we have to kind of keep that in mind, that they wanted to go with a much safer bet for them. Okay, catch some of these names in the early wing of this. JFK's other Dallas parade, Dallas Morning News. On that Tuesday, when Kennedy visited there in September of 1960, Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry estimated 175,000 people had turned out for Kennedy's festive motorcade. Jesse Curry will be the same one who's riding in the motorcade when Kennedy is assassinated, and he will go on the record later saying the shot came from the front. The candidate's open car moved eastbound with zero Secret Service protection under the benign gaze of the Texas School Book Depository. I kid you not. Kennedy had gone by the depository in a motorcade previously. Johnson was with him in a curiously anonymous marching band to the doors of Memorial Auditorium. Let's see. Members of the Jesuit High School band were very conscious that they might be charged with being Catholic, explained Sanders, so they took off their identification. At the right turn onto Ackerd, the candidates were met with a cloudburst of confetti that littered Kennedy's thatch of chestnut hair and turned the sidewalk of the Mobile building from battleship gray to paper white. Propelled by Kennedy's unfiltered star power, onlookers spilled into the street, many running up to touch the candidate or at least exchange greetings with Congressman Rayburn or Senator Ralph Yarborough. Sam Rayburn is very important for a number of reasons. He's a He's the Speaker of the House, and he is a big Texas politician, and his involvement at this stage is very crucial. As cars crept near to a standstill under the window of Continental Airlines office, Lyndon Johnson waved his cowboy hat like a traffic cop, motioning for an open lane. Just 3 cars back, Rayburn watched the mirth and the confetti with a mixture of incredulity and pleasure, blissfully unaware of the cancer that was stalking him. He would die actually shortly after that. 1 year later, President Kennedy would return to Dallas aboard Air Force One to visit the dying speaker at Baylor Hospital. Should investigate that trip as well. I've been looking into that one. But so what we have here is Kennedy in a trajectory before he's president, kind of walking in the same footsteps that will lead him to assassination in Dallas. Arriving at Love Field, Kennedy waved his new cowboy hat from a top stair. He boarded the Caroline, which is their campaign plan. Now, there's a few things about Caroline that are important here. Of course, it's the name of his daughter. And but the name Caroline was something that was very favorite of JFK. And it's interesting, if you go back into some of the research that we've done around Thomas Townsend Brown, there's something that he was a part of in 1930 that's loosely associated with this term, the Caroline Group, based on a yacht that hung out there off the coast of Cuba doing secret experiments. And that's how they get Thomas Townsend Brown down there. Now, I've identified this hot zone network of people who were involved around intelligence operations dealing with ancient ruins. And Ernest Hemingway is involved in that. John F. Kennedy is involved with that. And the people involved with this Caroline yacht are certainly involved with it. So one of the things that we pointed out in the Hot Zone episodes is that this oceanographer, Paulina Zalitsky, finds off the coast of Cuba an entire city underwater. And this makes national headlines in 2001. And she's doing it at the behest of the Castro government. She has a very interesting history as well. And we've gone into that here. For the purposes of this episode, all I want you to keep in mind is that here is Kennedy naming his campaign plan, Caroline. There's another signature there with this very important name, I think. And I think it is an ode to his former intelligence network, and not the CIA intelligence network, a totally different thing operating outside of it. And I think you're going to find that the FBI and the CIA wanted to know all about it, which is why Hemingway, when he's in Cuba, is hounded endlessly by these types of investigations, and that strange, uneasy, what we don't understand as a perfectly public relationship between Hemingway and Kennedy, but goes on behind the scenes, but has these incredible public tributes, such as the fact that most of Ernest Hemingway's incredible library of papers and books and all the rest of it are housed at the JFK Library. And if you went there now, you would see that's a big, major portion of it. But how does Hemingway end up at the Kennedy Library? Well, if you read those Hot Zone episodes, you're going to find out if you listen to that. So we go a little further down here. So we've got the Texas School Book Depository. We have Love Fields. This is kind of like walking in the footsteps of the 1960 piece. So despite the enthusiasm for Kennedy on Main Street, Dallas County did not go for the millionaire. It wasn't even close. In Dallas, Kennedy only received 38% of the popular vote, but because of all the surrounding counties and places that they visited, they were able to take Texas and its 24 electoral votes and win the election. This is a shot of them not far from the Main Street to Elm Street piece, which gets you right to where he was assassinated 3 years later. And there he is with LBJ in that motorcade, wide open 3 years earlier. It makes you wonder when you think about sort of the setup for the assassination. There's another shot from the very same piece. And what's interesting is I want to point out here that the woman who we see here, it's kind of hard to see her, but if you can take a look in there, that woman is the judge who will, sign LBJ in on Air Force One as the new president when Kennedy is assassinated. This is very strange because there's nothing official or legal about her doing that on Air Force One and him holding his hand on a Bible. She's not authorized to swear in the president. None of that. That was all for show. So LBJ could say, I'm in charge now. And so that nobody could challenge anything that had happened. But I think it's interesting that there are the three together. And the woman's name is Judge Sarah T. Hughes. She sits between JFK and LBJ, and it is 3 years later that she would give the oath of office to Lyndon Johnson at Love Field, which she wasn't qualified to do, and there's no protocol that wasn't binding or anything. He literally wanted that for the cameras, and he had Jackie come out after this trauma and stand with him in a bloodstained pink suit that she hadn't taken her clothes and changed them from that. And so he's standing there, swearing himself in a false manner with this judge. Well, there she is in that picture. So hints, giving us that idea what's going on behind the scenes. Now, this is also an interesting thing that happens, which is that 6,000 people gather during the same visit to Dallas in 1960, before he's president. And it's in the Chance Vought Aircraft Factory, Dallas Naval Air Station. There it is. Well, that name, Chance Vought, is pretty interesting. And if you look up the whole Linco Vought LTV deal, they become incredibly huge after the assassination of President Kennedy. And it's interesting because, and this is something that, again, I'm going to refer back to Professor Scott on this. He's somebody who noticed that he tracked a great deal of stock movements after 9/11, and that there were all these shorts around airlines. That is, people with foreknowledge of a deep event happening, and they made a lot of money off of it. Well, here's kind of the 1963 version of that, and it involves the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository, named D.H. or Dryhole Bird, who was a close friend of LBJ. He was the cousin of Admiral Richard Byrd, who had gone to Antarctica and had taken with him, of course, our friend Lloyd Berkner. And he is also the cousin to Harry Byrd, who is the senator from Virginia who holds all of the puppet strings over the NASA budget. And I do want to clarify this. There's a senator from West Virginia named Robert Byrd, but he's not part of the Byrd family. So he gets brought up sometimes because he was the mentor for people like Biden and Hillary Clinton, and he used to be a Klansman and all this stuff. So it's very interesting, but that Byrd is not associated with these Byrds. But Dryhole Bird is very interesting because he owns the Texas School Book Depository, and he is investing in this LTV, Linco Vought company. Now, this is very interesting because that company will soar, and his initial investment of $5 million will be $50 million by 1965. So this is somebody who profits a great deal from the assassination, and the idea that he owned the building and therefore could control access to who was in and who was out lends itself to this idea. So here's the official story on Oswald and all the rest, that he, is this loser in life. He's disgruntled, even though he's been all over the world. And, he's working for $1.25 an hour, and his, he has this beautiful Russian wife, but she can't stand him. And, there's no future for him. And he just wants to get back at the world by killing Kennedy. And also because he's a rabid communist. So the problem is, of course, that on the record, we have him working for Guy Bannister, a rabid anti-communist. So therefore, that story's out the window. And so the deep intelligence layers that you get with Oswald. But the official story is that 6 weeks before the assassination, he walks into this place and gets a job. And nobody even knew that Kennedy was going by that window. So this idea that he would have this kind of crazy luck as this disgruntled person who wanted to be a big shot, and was a crazy communist who wanted to shoot the president, he just happens to get a job on that motorcade route. Isn't that something? Well, there's a whole thing around Oswald, and of course we've done documentaries. There's even one that we did, I think it's 7 years old now, Lord.
Wow.
Agent Oswald, the CIA patsy. But everything, there's so much in there. One of the things that's in there that's important is him getting the job at the Texas School Book Depository, and how that all happens through the Paines and also George de Mohrenschildt. And the Paines are very interesting because they're connected directly to Walter Dornberger, and Dornberger being that general that was saved from the judgment at Nuremberg, because von Braun said, that's my old boss. I need him. If you want me to make rocket ships to go to the moon, I need him, even if he is guilty of crimes against humanity and he's going to be executed, take him out. And they did. And he became the vice president of Bell Helicopter. Well, that's a pretty good gig. Interestingly enough, that's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So that made things damn convenient. And it just so happens when Oswald comes back from the Soviet Union that he's staying with the Paines. He and his wife and their children are staying with the Paines. So you've got layers there of moving him into position, and that's how he lands in that Texas School Book Depository. But when they say, well, this was a guy moving boxes around and all the rest of it, think about it. Lee Harvey Oswald is going every day to a job that is owned by D.H. Byrd, who's friends, as I said, with LBJ, has this connection through his cousin to the whole Antarctica enterprise, and is also a major figure, investor, and somebody who's co-owner of LTV, which is an experimental aerospace company. So he's showing up there for work. Here we have Oswald again with another aerospace signature, just showing up for work. What did he say when he left New Orleans to all his friends at Riley Coffee Company? I'm going to join NASA. It's kind of weird, isn't it? If he's supposed to be this big left-wing guy who hates American militarism, that he wants to join up with NASA. So whenever you get around Oswald, including his association with Bannister, you're dealing with the UFO file, which Bannister started for the FBI, and on we could go in that direction. What we want here is that crossover, and we've got it with Byrd, and then now we're dealing again with LBJ and that strange milieu of associations. Now, who's operating in that zone? Let's get the person who investigated the JFK assassination. The only person who actually brought someone to trial for it is Jim Garrison. So Garrison, in the middle of the heat of the trial, is trying to get information off to his friend who runs Ramparts magazine named Warren Hinkle. And this is in a book called If You Have a Lemon, Make Lemonade by Warren Hinkle. It's a very interesting book, but the Garrison section is the part that can't be missed. And basically, think of Ramparts magazine as like an early version of Rolling Stone or the Village Voice, where it mixes up culture with left-wing politics and things. So he's speaking here, and he's talking about these calls he's getting from Garrison, which seem to be almost frantic, and he's ducking the calls. So when Garrison calls him in his office, he tells the secretary, no, no, no. And then he goes to another room. And so finally, Garrison reaches him in the mail room, and he picks up the phone. And so this is what Garrison has to say. This is urgent, Jim Garrison said. Can you take this into your mailroom? They'd never think to tap the mailroom extension. I excused myself to go to the mailroom for a moment on a matter of high priority and left the investor who he was meeting with, sputtering like a referee without a whistle, alone with the latest negative balance sheets in the mailroom. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. This is risky, but I have little choice. It's imperative I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oilmen do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder the way we first thought. This is part of the investigation he was doing on Clint Murchison and H.L. Hunt, who were major figures around the assassination. And he's saying, basically, I have new information. Those Texas oilmen do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way that we first thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination. But as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. This is crucial. So when we get around the CIA files and the ones that they won't let out, there's three sets of files. One of those files are all the Joe Anidis files, which show that he created the Oswald project, ultra secret agent who controlled, the Oswald setup, but then later interfaced with all of the inquiry committees that were dealing with the JFK assassination, like the House Assassinations Committee. He was the liaison, so he knew what to steer them away from. But the other set of records, it's not talked about very much, all the Garrison records, the investigation of the Garrison, all of the interference that the CIA ran on the Garrison investigation. Now, this is important because those records coming out would show there was a reason they're interfering with his investigation, because he's coming to this. This is the point, which is he gets to the aerospace aspect. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination, but as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. I've got the names of the 3 companies and their employers who were involved in setting up the president's murder. Do you have a pencil? All right. I wrote down the names of the 3 defense contractors. Garrison identified them as Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics. And the names of those executives in their employ who the district attorney said had been instrumental in the murder of Jack Kennedy. I also logged a good deal of information about a mysterious minister who was supposed to have crossed the border into Mexico with Lee Harvey Oswald shortly before the assassination. The man wasn't a minister at all, Garrison said, but an executive with a major defense supplier in clerical disguise. There's a lot of disguises, a lot of masquerades that take place in relation to the JFK assassination. And that's where you get the 2 Oswalds and these types of things. But here we have now someone who was deep in the investigation. We can't even imagine, we get some idea from Garrison's writings where he was going, but he kept encountering this aerospace aspect. When he went to interview Oswald's comrades there at Riley Coffee Company, he found most of them were gone, and they had gone to join NASA, or they had some other very high-end aerospace job. So whatever, the way that the CIA had created these networks, they could use a coffee place, they could use a restaurant, they could use NASA. They had this network, and the aerospace piece was what always came back to. So whenever you get around that piece, you have to conclude there's a deep, deep aspect of the aerospace wing involved in the assassination. Then the question becomes why. That's when we get back to the UFO file. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight on LBJ and Nixon and the UFO file. And what we're discovering basically is that space plays a major factor in this. That is the hidden aspect going on in that battle over the UFO file. We're going to find so much of the political ramifications that we've lived through, including the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and other pieces to this puzzle, which have very dedicated space aspects, but are all a buildup to this control war, which is coming from above, and which they're openly talking about with this whole idea of trains of satellites around the Earth. And it's something actually that John Warner tweeted about today. And he asked the right question. What's going on here? What is going on? What is this weirdness with Musk and, putting up these satellites? We can't even see the stars. And then suddenly he's taking over Twitter and they're electing this guy space president and everyone's giving him a thumbs up. This whole thing needs to be a long, deep look straight in the eye to see who's behind the manipulation that's going on around this. And we're going to get into that further as we go tonight. Now, we're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I have a couple more things to get to. Let's see if I can do that in a reasonable time. I'll try to do it in the next 10 minutes. Miss Olivia, how are we doing?
We're doing great. You want to field a question?
Absolutely.
I wanted to circle back to this. Fernando Ferreira says, Senator NASA, do we have a reliable source on this?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Anyone who's studied LBJ has the Senator NASA piece. And so it's one of those buzz terms. But if you want to find him in the middle of NASA, he's early on one of the biggest proponents in the Senate for the space program. So just as the 1958 speech that I read shows, he's saying everything relies on our position in outer space, and his connections throughout will show that. You're going to find aerospace, the space program, and remember that whole buildup to Apollo takes place under Johnson. So Johnson is the hardcore heartbeat of NASA. He, in fact, hijacks the Space Center that was going to be built very close by to here at Harvard. And that becomes the whole Houston Space Center with NASA and everything there. So if you're looking for space with Johnson, all you have to go is a half-inch deep. And if you go deeper than that, you're going to find the UFO file, which we'll point out to you shortly. What else have you got?
Devlin Liam McGregor. So bottom line, it was LBJ a Texas frontman for Operation Paperclip Nazis?
Well, it's interesting you say that. One of the things that he claimed was that in private is that von Braun was his best friend. This is interesting because von Braun also became friends with Hoover. And we know that
so weird.
LBJ and Hoover were neighbors too. Let's keep that in mind. This is an interesting shot when they were trying to normalize von Braun's image for the public because he was going to become the hero of the Apollo program. In the 50s, they started this, but just take a look at that. That is good friend rocking out on the banjo. And it is, in fact, Miss Olivia. You gotta love that one.
It's great.
So, lightening up the old image for von Braun. Von Braun, I believe, towards the end of his life, with the things that he imparted to Carol Rosin regarding the false flag attacks they were going to do, the whole alien threat piece has been spot on with that. And I think everything that he said has come to pass. The only thing we're waiting for now is the UFO alien threat piece, which he said would be a false UFO threat. And, that's interestingly enough, that's exactly what I believe. Now, pieces around the assassination. This becomes very important. And then we're going to drift off into LBJ's position of the presidency and the clash with Nixon. Because remember, initially Nixon's trying to get in. And who's he being supported by? Howard Hughes Aerospace. And what does he do to build up Howard Hughes Aerospace? He allows them to have their aerospace company become a medical charity, so they're not taxed. That ingratiates Nixon to such a degree with Hughes that Hughes will become this just major supporter. And Hughes is involved all the way from Watergate back to the Roswell file and beyond. So Hughes, when you're looking at that, the other documentary that I did, this is 2 years ago, and that is X-Protect UFO File Assassins. It's right on the channel. You can't miss it. That's a very important overview of Hughes and also Hughes' knowledge of the UFO file. That's crucial. That stems directly into the Roswell incident. But he, like a lot of these people who spend time in the air, they see UFOs. So these early pilots, Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, there's a piece in here which is so strange that I couldn't even think of how to fit it into this episode. But Lloyd Berkner had set up all of the radio pieces for Amelia Earhart with the Friendship, nonstop flight that she did. And when she disappeared, all of the knowledge and all the connections of Berkman to Amelia Earhart disappear as well. They're wiped from the historical record. And so at NIST, they looked into this and they said, we don't know why they got rid of all these references to Berkman. But I found that was a weird sideshow in the Berkman story. But again, whenever you're dealing with the aviators in that period, they're utilized for two things. One, the early UFO file piece. They're seeing the stuff. Two, they can see ruins on the ground. Remember, flight is new to humanity. And when we get that ability to look down, you find things like the Nazca lines and all the rest of it. But you find other stuff too. And those things don't make it into the history books. That's what's crucial. That's where the hot zone story becomes important. But I'll leave that for another episode. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 142, deep on LBJ. Let's keep going with LBJ unless you got something.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good.
Very good. Let's see how much I can get in here. Okay, so Berkner becomes very important to me because he's in the Robertson panel. He helped set up Blue Book. He's been to Antarctica. He's a key figure on the inside for this X-Tech program. And it's very hard to identify the people who are deeply involved with the UFO file. There are some that are on the record that we just know for sure. And Vannevar Bush is a very important one. Berkner was hardcore as his assistant in the UFO file. And you're going to find him intermingled with not only Oppenheimer, but John G. Trump and others. So this identification of the UFO file directors and leaders, we get a window into that by studying Berkner. Now, let's study something that I think is quite remarkable about Berkner, which is when President Kennedy is going from Love Field, he will make this, go through the whole city, and then he'll make this turn, very strange turn, down by the Texas School Book Depository. And, you have the entire assassination scene. He is headed, though, to the Dallas Trade Mart. The question that I've had around this is what was he going to do at the Trade Mart? Well, it's very interesting. And this is kind of the breakthrough that we need to study on this. But what he was going to do was meet with and include in his speech Lloyd Berkner. That's who he was going to meet. Now, Berkner was in Dallas, even though he was living in Florida previous to this. But no, now he's in Dallas. And while he's in Dallas, he's set up this whole scientific institute. And he is, again, working on this thing about we need to attract these great minds into these scientific fields. And by the way, it should be more civilian driven than military. This is why I'm getting a lot of X share from him. Now, I want to say that it has been raised before that there was something that President Kennedy was going to reveal in his speech in Dallas, which is why they didn't want him to make it to that speech. And it's been raised, and it's been hard to pin down. This may give us something very deep in history, especially when, for a long time, they didn't allow the speech that he was going to give to come out. Now, the speech that they have him give, I've read it through, supposedly he was going to give this speech, is all about nuclear weapons buildup. Doesn't make any sense. Kennedy had just made a dramatic speech in June of 1963 saying we need to, realize that a war with the Soviet Union we can't fight because even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. And he also talks about re-examining our attitudes towards that kind of militarism and how we can't have a Pax Americana forced on the world by American weapons of war. When you have all those things lined up, how does it make any sense to start giving speeches promoting nuclear militarism? It doesn't. Well, interestingly enough, that speech only came out to the public through someone named Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus fame. Stanley Marcus said, well, I got it and I publicized it. I put it in all these newspapers. I sold it as a pamphlet and all these different things. And they said, where did you get it from? And he said, I got it from LBJ. So LBJ, that speech that supposedly was written up for Kennedy to speak at the Dallas Trade Mart, that they've said this was the speech. He wasn't going to say anything important. Don't worry about it. Actually, it's an LBJ concoction, potentially, because he's the only one, and he gave it to Marcus, and Marcus spread it out there. So that didn't come directly from the speechwriter, who would have been Sorensen. That would have been an interesting, very interesting thing. But I'm going to go over this piece because I think there's a huge payoff in it. So let's see if you can track with me. All right. So first, heading to the Trade Mart, President Kennedy is going to meet with Berkner. And the thing I was just referring to is the unspoken speech of President Kennedy, which eventually, like I said, they'll put this very militaristic sounding speech in its place. Okay, one of the interesting and strange pieces about this meeting is that the planning behind the scenes, it's going to be something very dramatic, including the fact that Kennedy wants to have one of the flags that have flown over the Capitol, and he wants to present it to Berkner. So to me, Berkner is going to give, they're going to give some kind of a speech that sets new territory. Now, those of us who know Kennedy's relationship to the UFO file might think it's something as dramatic as that. But even if you think that he was going to announce the joint moon mission with the Soviets there, whatever it happened to be, the fact of Berkner's presence is crucial. But let's take the notes that lead up to that. This is the person who is setting up the speech at the trademark. Guy's name is Al Mitchell, and he reads out the points here. These are his actual points from his memo. And he says, the president gives the flag and the colors from the national capital are first flown at this campus, which is this campus of the scientific institute that our friend Berkner is founding. President Kennedy arrives at luncheon site by automobile. President Kennedy gives a flag that has been flown over the Capitol to Dr. Lloyd Berkner at entrance to the luncheon site, the Dallas Trademark. Dr. Berkner transfers the flag to a courier, scientist, or presidential aide. The courier leaves by helicopter for the SCAS campus, which is the scientific university he's setting up. During the luncheon address, President Kennedy comments on GRCSW, which is this scientific institute, in terms of a national dedication, a center of basic research and postdoctoral education of national importance. A theater TV screen shows the south center of the building, a military honor guard, local band, the helicopter. President Kennedy commands the raising of the colors. Courier presents colors to the honor guard. Band plays national anthem as the colors are raised, fade out. So this speech that he's going to give is all about science, and he has Berkner joining him. And there are indications with the plans that they're making here that when he gives the speech, at a certain point, Berkner comes up and he presents this flag to him. So this is gigantic if you think about the different things that Kennedy has done on this trip. For this to be included here, something major was going on. And whatever it was that they were planning to do with this, I think it opens the door to the idea that something major was going to be announced about space and science. That much is obvious by the presence of Berkner. It's never mentioned when they talk about the trademark. They always say that he's going there to talk about finance or whatever in the traditional record of it. And then later it came out, oh, well, there's this speech, the unspoken speech and all that. And that speech, as I said, its origins are from Stanley Marcus, who is the son of the Neiman Marcus. He's the heir to Neiman Marcus. And when they track him down and they say, well, where'd you get this from? He says, LBJ. So LBJ's version of that speech is what we have. So a couple of things about the unspoken speech. Now, this is interesting. Because of Marcus, JFK's unspoken speech is forever enshrined in the library at SMU, along with Marcus's entire collection of books and papers. Its title page bears the words, privately printed for Stanley Marcus, 1964. Smith said her father obtained a copy of the speech from his close friend, Lyndon B. Johnson, and had it published by Carl Herzog, the father of fine press printing, in Texas. Kennedy was late in coming and later, said Jerry Smith, now 77. Her dad is Stanley Marcus. People were getting a little uneasy. J. Eric Johnson, president of the co-sponsoring Dallas Citizens Council and the city's future mayor, approached the podium and said, can I have your attention, please? There's been a delay in the arrival of the motorcade. And it's interesting because she says, it's fascinating to me that Kennedy even came to Dallas because my father had warned Johnson in private that it would be a very hostile city for him to kind of resume this activity of campaigning and that they shouldn't do it. So that's also interesting, the idea there. Now, here is a shot of LBJ after he becomes president and the assassination happens. One of the people that he meets with is Harry Byrd, who controls NASA's purse strings and is the brother of Admiral Byrd. This is him kissing his hand which you don't see a president do that very often in public. I think it shows the power of Harry Byrd.
Wow.
And they've been, tag teaming the funds for the space program when he was in the Senate this whole time. But here he is meeting with Byrd. And remember also in the spin of all this that D.H. Byrd owns the Texas School Book Depository, and he's friends with LBJ, and his cousin is Admiral Byrd on one hand, but his other cousin is Admiral Byrd's brother, Harry. Well, the whole thing there is one big shot, one big picture.
Wow, it says so much.
It is. It's an undeniable image. And, they made a big deal out of, I think it was Obama who bowed to the Saudis. And this whole idea, when you're a president in that position and you put yourself like that, you have to really keep in mind the power of that. It's like kissing the ring of the mafia don.
Exactly.
So what we have then is the Dallas Trade Mart incident is all about Berkman, and it's all about presenting this flag. And there are, in fact, plans. I was able to get the plans from the Dallas Library, and I was able to download them, and I have them all here for exactly what they were going to do. And it's quite interesting the way that they're talking about it, because there are hints in here that we're going to play it like it's straight before, boom, we have this big thing going on. And it's pretty interesting because they talk about it, and they're very nervous, of course, well, it's the president, they would be. But when they go into it and they talk about Berkner being at the entrance of the luncheon site, and he gets the flag, and then he takes the flag from President Kennedy that he receives, and he goes out, and there's a helicopter waiting outside, and he gives the flag to the helicopter. I mean, this is quite a scene, and not your average kind of setup. That whole piece, I think what I'm going to do is make a PDF out of it and make it available for everyone, because I think it's quite important to get a hint of what's happening there. Now, the only other thing I think that's interesting about this is, I'll get to the quote on that afterwards, but basically inside there, the person who's setting it up, Mitchell, makes a point that, this is it. This is the line. I found the letter. So this is the actual letter from Eric Johnson to the person who's setting up the event at the Dallas Trade Mart. They also, by the way, were going to do this entire event at the university campus on the other side of town. So they weren't going to have it at the Trade Mart, and it was changed. So the Trade Mart is an addition there that wasn't initially planned. That's kind of important because you wouldn't need to go by the Texas School Book Depository and all the rest. Enclosed for your consideration are 3 suggestions by Al Mitchell for gadgetry involvement of the center during the president's luncheon speech, November 22nd. If none of these 3 suggestions seems appropriate, please let us know. We have 4 or 5 other ideas which can be presented for consideration. As I suggested to Nell, I think it would be advisable for Al Mitchell to sit down with the president's representative who'll be working out many details involved in this, quote, seemingly inconsequential action. Now, if a president's coming there to give you a flag, that's a kind of a big deal. So what is he saying? Seemingly inconsequential action. So it's sort of like they have a surprise. They know they have a surprise, and there's going to be some announcement there between Berkner and JFK. And he says, don't worry about it. This whole thing will play out in this seemingly inconsequential action. And that's Eric Johnson, the Texas Instruments Incorporated. This is interesting. Texas Instruments is what Berkner had joined, and he was on their board now. Now, Berkner, let's fast forward in time with Berkner for a minute. Remember again, Lloyd Berkner he had gone in 1928 as a 22-year-old radio whiz to Antarctica with Byrd, and he went there with him for 2 years. And Byrd, you're going to love this picture. Is this not a rock and roll picture of Byrd? Look at that. That's Admiral Byrd there in his incredible getup for Antarctica.
Very glam rock.
It is. But interestingly enough, he has such warm feelings for his friend that he shares here that it reads, this is the book, and Little America is the radio station that they set up in Antarctica over the 2 years that they were there. And he says about his friend in the book, aerial exploration in the Antarctic, the flight of the South Pole, to my friend, Lloyd Berkman, with high adoration and esteem and enduring appreciation for his very great contribution to our expedition and his very unusual loyalty. Richard Byrd, New Year's Day, 1931. So that relationship all the way back here. Now, here's what is also interesting, which is we find out, the more we go into this, that D.H. Byrd has a role in funding Admiral Byrd. This becomes important. What he is known for, Berkner, is he's known for the International Geographical Year, which is something he put together with all these other scientists. And he said, let's include the Russians with this. And it's a worldwide survey of the electromagnetism of the Earth and the geomagnetism of the Earth. And it sets up a foundation for the space race. It sets up the foundation for his ionospheric studies, which he's been doing for decades, so that he creates essentially the first HARP. And this is the test of the ionosphere. He will eventually go to Alaska and set up the foundation for HARP. The International Geophysical Year is a strange incident, and it seems to me some kind of agreement on some understanding by all countries that there's a necessity to band together in knowledge, even if they're going to spy on each other or whatever, because this is so powerful in a sense. 1958, the year that made Antarctica the people, politics, and the International Geophysical Year, 57 to 58. It's very interesting. One of the things I note about this is that Edgar Cayce, when he is forecasting into the future, 58, 58, 58 comes up seemingly randomly. And a lot of people look into the Cayce readings, think, why did he say this about 58 and that about 58? Like 58 is the start of this period. 58 is when they, the Atlantean crystal piece, the technology will be rediscovered. 58, 58. Well, it's interesting because if you go back to that date, the two crucial things that are happening are, of course, the invention, the creation of NASA happens in that corridor. Sputnik happens in that corridor. But the invention of the laser happens in that time period, which is very important when you think about the whole Cayce Atlantean technology piece. The other thing that's crucial when we look at this is that Cayce is saying 1958. Well, this International Geophysical Year, the IGY that Berkman has created and put together all these scientists to study this kind of whole magnetic spectrum around the Earth. This is a gigantic move, and it involves the complete exploration of Antarctica in a way that they couldn't do it. And what happens? Berkman goes back to Antarctica for the first time in 20 years. And there he is again. Very interesting indeed. But IGY is going to become very important. Here's something that was slipped in under the radar when IGY was happening that we find out through the records. Though it was never on the IGY agenda, a secret project took place. This project was called Argus, the U.S. military experiment in which 3 rocket-propelled nuclear electron shells were detonated in near space above fallout levels by the Navy in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1958. The resulting auroral displays and communications blackouts were recorded by unsuspecting IGY stations as astonishing anomalies. But many scientists had their suspicions at a time when nuclear testing was under heated negotiations. Project Argus was a potential embarrassment, which explains why the U.S. government did not admit to the project until 1959. Nevertheless, nuclear testing was carried out during the IGY, 137 detonations. Wow. With the purpose of studying fallout using different altitudes. Well, so they've admitted to the nuclear part of this. How about the IGY as a huge network for tracking unidentified flying objects? That's another piece and use for this. And it's also, hey, we know about satellites, we have them, but now we're going to put them in space, and Russia does it first. That sets up a whole different scenario as well, because Russia's going to be up there. They're going to see UFOs on that level. We have to have some kind of treaty or agreement with them about how we approach that publicly. President Kennedy will come forward and say, I want to, with the Soviet Union, and in his talks to Khrushchev, say, I want with the UFO file us to share information so that there isn't a nuclear incident. Well, if you look at Berkner's original recommendation coming out of things like the Robertson panel around UFOs, he says we should be in communication with the Russians on the UFO issue because we don't want to have a nuclear incident based on an unidentified flying object going over one of their nuclear facilities. This tells me that we're getting direct. I mean, Berkner was on JFK's space science advisory team, but it seems like he's getting that direct information. And so Kennedy's making this part of his core policy. That core policy is part of the assassination piece. And that has to be understood, because if you get into the UFO sharing part, this is what makes JFK a threat to that deep state operation. I think it goes beyond the things that he was challenging them on. And although I think that, things about them wanting to go into Vietnam, the militarism, and I think that things around Kennedy's actions in the Federal Reserve and all these other pieces, they certainly had their reasons for removing President Kennedy. He was their enemy because he was looking for freedom and had a vision and idealism for the world. But the UFO file provides the ultimate denouement of the whole situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here in X-Series 142, going deep on this very interesting Lloyd V. Berkner, who had gone and been the center of the Antarctica visits. He had been the center of the development of Brookhaven, which there's a lot of UFO reputation around Brookhaven. And he developed accelerated particle colliders, which that's how we got the CERN Hadron Collider. And he also was the person that President Kennedy was going to meet at the Jealous Trade Mart as he was about to be assassinated. That's standing in a lot of different places, not to mention the fact that he was on the Robertson panel and the whole setup of Blue Book. So this is a core piece, a core actor. And I think what we're looking at is somebody definitely involved on the X-Share side, but being utilized maybe by both X-Protect and X-Share. The other thing that I want to add in relation to our friend is his relationship, Berkner, to James McDonald. James McDonald will be the UFO researcher who is a physicist who will bring all of these different pieces together in the 60s and try to come up with a coherent UFO policy, and will go before Congress, et cetera, with it. Well, interestingly enough, he gets the ability to speak to Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson utilizes him for information around the UFO file. In his own memoirs is a whole setup about how LBJ was using the Senate before he became VP to instigate an investigation into UFOs. It's not talked about, but it's there. And there's a book about McDonald called Firestorm, which is very revealing. And there's a couple of quotes from it I'm going to get to tonight. And then I'm going to show Berkner meeting with McDonald shortly before his own death. And this is very core. We're going to be taking your questions in about 10 minutes here. Miss Olivia, how are we doing on that
We're
clock?
doing great.
Excellent.
Do you want to start with Berkner right now?
Sure.
Okay. Sarah Ajagu again says, yes, DJ, this Berkner flag thing is gigantic. It opens the door to corporate education, institutionalization of space race, not led by military now.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And
yes.
Timothy Guessing says,
wow.
The Berkner Hall is at the University of Texas in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there. They have a Berkner High School in Dallas, and the scientific institutes that he set up are still active. It's quite interesting. He had that amazing impact. There's no question about it. This was a visionary person, and the deeper we get into his relationship with JFK, we're going to find that the term UFO advisor is going to be something that we need to adopt to understand the relationship of these people. Scientific advisor doesn't cut it, because this subject was so secret that they would need this. There's only a few of them, I think, that we can pinpoint. Donald Menzel is another one. And he's somebody who, again, had to have the public face of a debunker. This is just the way that this works out. What else you got?
Jeffrey Halsey, was there any intersection that you know of between Berkner and Tesla?
That's a really good question. What I found is that the programs that Berkner was in utilized certain types of principles that Tesla brought out, but I haven't found them meeting yet. I'm sure other people have looked for it. I wonder if it would be on the record, but I have found him on the record with people like Oppenheimer. And so that those relationships are much better known. And another person who is on the Robertson panel is Alvarez. And Alvarez, as I pointed out to you again, has that combination of the UFO file, the JFK part, and in the 70s, he's using cosmic rays in Egypt to see if he can find buried rooms in the Great Pyramid or under the Sphinx. So these people are operational with that kind of hot zone knowledge, the UFO file and the political intrigue. This thing, you know, over and over again, there's a signature around certain people where you find this. And this is the piece that we need to follow, I think. But there you can see we've got Berkner and Alvarez, very, very deep pieces. Alvarez, I'll just explain briefly that his role in the Robertson panel, again, is as a debunker, but they're taking him in, his expertise around physics. What he will do, because of his great photographic knowledge, is he will be the person that they will try to debunk the second shooter idea in the Zapruder film with. So here he is showing up in the setup of Project Blue Book on one hand, trying to debunk UFOs, and then he shows up later trying to say, oh, there was no second shooter. I'll show you how this works photographically and all the rest of it. And it was all bunk. So he was used for his expertise that way. And then the third jump in that mix is that he's doing all this cosmic ray investigation of the Sphinx and stuff. So this guy is a deep operator because he's going into that ancient technology piece on one hand. He's at the interface of the UFO file and the JFK assassination, the war over the UFO file. And so, you know, we're looking at these types of figures. When you look again at Berkner, look at the things that he's involved with. CERN, Antarctica, the UFO file. The JFK is going to meet him when he's assassinated. I mean, what are we talking about in terms of where these people, you know, the groups that these people are representing? To understand that struggle between the X-Share groups and the X-Protect groups is crucial. That's why the Nixon LBJ thing can give us that insight on it. And I have more on Nixon tonight. I haven't focused enough on him, but I will. A couple of quick things about Berkner and McDonald, and then we'll get on to your questions. Here is, by the way, Berkner Bank. Berkner Island is there in Antarctica, and he set up Little America and all that, and the radio stations out of Antarctica. But Berkner Bank is interesting. Why did they name this extra thing after him too? Well, it's a submerged bank, and you know, it's in the Southern Ocean. This is interesting to me. If you just think about this, that the submerged bank is there, right there where that red circle is. So this is an indication then that something is going to rise up there, and then it will be Berkner. He'll be part of the new wave of this land rising piece. Start to think about the different ways in which this could apply. And when you think about Antarctica and you think about all the things that we've looked at in relation to that, and people have gone off the rails about Antarctica, right? You've seen people saying, oh, there's space groups there, there's advanced Nazis there, there's everything. Well, it's easy to say anything about Antarctica because we don't know very much about it here in civilian land. What we do know are some key things. One of the things I put on the record, that John Warner put on the record, because his dad, as the senator from Virginia, had been involved in deep freeze. And on this program, John Warner put on the record that his dad, when he questioned him about it, was very cagey, didn't want to give him any information and didn't take him on those trips. But he did tell him it was about space. Whatever they're doing there is about space. That's important, I think. And John Warner, he was in a position as senator and the head of the Navy to know that. Now, let's do this just briefly about McDonald. And McDonald's very important. As I said, he's the person who brought forward so much of this. He interfaced with the groups that were around, like NICAP and the UFO groups, and he brought a kind of an air of scientific dignity to the whole thing and was just known as a very straight up guy. He had great investigations of UFO cases. He knew that they were dealing with something and that it was covered up in the government. What's fascinating for me is that he had the ear of LBJ. LBJ knew that whatever McDonald was up to, this is crucial. Now, Berkner has set up all of these space things for NASA and all the rest of it. And he's been on this Space Council, the Robertson panel about UFOs. Now, there's a meeting that takes place between McDonald and Berkner, and this is going to be very important. But let me read you this first. McDonald spoke before the United States Congress for a UFO hearing in 1968. In part, he stated his opinion that UFOs are entirely real and we do not know what they are because we've laughed them out of court. The possibility that these are extraterrestrial devices that we are dealing with, surveillance from some advanced technology, is a possibility I take very seriously, which sets him at odds with the public face of the scientific community. So it's a very brave thing that he's doing here. McDonald emphasized that he accepted the extraterrestrial hypothesis as a possibility not due to any specific evidence in its favor, but because he judged competing hypotheses as inadequate. McDonald did not accept the conclusions of the Condon report because 30% of the cases studied in the report remained unexplained. 1969, McDonald was a speaker at the American Association of the Advancement of Science. There he delivered a lecture, Science in Default, which Jerome Clark calls one of the most powerful scientific defenses of the UFO reality ever mounted. McDonald discussed in detail a handful of well-documented UFO cases which seemed, he thought, to defy interpretations of traditional science. Other prominent figures like Donald Menzel, who I just mentioned, hounded him, and there were a lot of debunking attempts against him. They tried to just take his reputation down in a heavy, dirty way. But he actually gave, in 1970, he appeared before a committee of the United States Congress, and he was providing evidence about the development of supersonic transport planes because he had this background. He could do it. And what they did was they took the opportunity to attack his UFO piece, and they kind of were trying to drive him over the edge a little bit. Now, what's interesting is he gets a congressman named Silvio Conti in Massachusetts to pair up with him, and they start doing UFO Congress. Like, let's get a congressional hearings going on UFOs. This is pretty bold, and I think this is his death warrant, in fact. In March 71, McDonald's wife, said that they were getting a divorce. McDonald seems to have started planning for his suicide, they say. So what happens, the story is that he attempts to commit suicide by shooting himself, but he survives, and he is blind, and he's in the hospital, and then he disappears, and they find his body 2 months later. Like tucked away somewhere close to a bridge spanning the Canada del Oro Wash near Tucson, Arizona. They found a body that was later identified with a .38 caliber revolver was found close to him and a suicide note. So there he was. Now, it's very hard to measure what McDonald had gone through, but it sounds to me that there was something unusual with his death, as we often see, just like when we hear about Morris Jessup in 1958. He is on this incredible trajectory with UFOs. Remember, he has a great background as an astronomer. He's done archaeology. He's been in South America, Mexico. And this guy shows up in the middle of the UFO field. He does the 2 really heavy books about UFOs, creates a kind of a dignified thing around the subject. And then he's found in a park in Florida, and he's tied the gas hose so that he's killed by carbon monoxide in his car. The person that he was friends with, who he was sharing his research with, is J. Manson Valentine. J. Manson Valentine finds the Bimini Road some 10 years later using a KC prediction about the Bimini Road in the hot zone. So when we thread these pieces together, we can see when X Protect bumps people off. It becomes very obvious, in fact. And one of the things I want to say about him, if I can find it here, is that Bob Wood is somebody who went on the record and said, and Bob Wood is known in a lot of UFO circles, but this is in 1971. And he said he spoke to him before he committed suicide. And he said, I've actually broken through. I've figured out what they're doing with the UFO file. I know what's up. And he said, what is it? And he said, don't worry, we're going to plan some time to meet and I'm going to tell you. So he's never able to do it because he commits suicide. So Wood, skeptical of that. It sounds to me like something was going on, but when you think of the level that McDonald was on, then it starts to make sense. All right, let's wrap the whole picture together. Now, in 1967, June of 1967, there's a meeting that takes place, and it's McDonald meeting up with our friend Lloyd Berkner. He meets with Lloyd Berkner for 3 hours. He's going there because he wants to get him on board with his congressional UFO inquiry. They meet for 3 hours. He goes to Dallas to meet him. He comes back excited, thinking he's going to do all this stuff with Berkner. Now, Berkner goes from there to Washington, D.C., where he's going to meet at the American Academy of Sciences. And he's going to, give a speech and all this kind of stuff. And he goes before this meeting, he goes down to a fast food place, has a little food. He comes back upstairs, in the middle of the meeting, dies. Now, the timing around Berkner meeting with McDonald and them doing this, collaboration around the UFO thing and him dying at the age of 62 is unusual for me. I mean, yeah, he could have died of a heart attack, and it could have been the natural cause, but the timing around these things for me is absolutely exceptional. When we think of the trajectory around it, it gives us a picture of what's going on there with the connections on the deepest level on the UFO file and the political football that it became between LBJ and Johnson. And the other piece is, of course, that LBJ, like Nixon, is very aware that Kennedy is assassinated over the UFO file. It becomes very important that they are boxed in with each other, because one of the key things between Nixon and Johnson is they each have enough blackmail on each other, but they sort of short circuit each other out. So to round this whole thing out and go to your questions, I'm going to read one of those attempts, and it's at the end of LBJ's life. And this is very interesting because it comes from a story by Don Folsom, who was a White House press correspondent, knew a lot about Nixon and knew all these players. So he's talking with Haldeman and some of these aides of Nixon, and he gets this story, which I think says a lot. So the beginning of 1973, January. Now, January 22nd or January 20th is when LBJ dies. Okay. So somewhere just maybe a few days before his death, Nixon is he's just been reelected in a landslide, but this Watergate thing is really starting to break on him. And Congress opens saying, we're going to do Watergate hearings, which is his worst nightmare. So Nixon's blackmailing efforts even extended to former President Lyndon Johnson. 1994 book based on Haldeman's personal diaries shows that in January 1973, Nixon tried to coerce LBJ into using his influence with the Senate Democrats to derail the Watergate investigation. Haldeman said Nixon threatened to go public with information that LBJ bugged the Nixon campaign in 1968. When Johnson heard of the threat, he got very hot and called Deke, the number 3 man in the FBI, and said to him that if the Nixon people are going to play with this, he could release information that would be even more damaging to Nixon. The information that President Johnson was going to release was deleted from Haldeman's diary, the National Security Council meeting during the Carter administration. They took it out. They had the diary and they took this information out, which scrutinized it for sensitive national security material. It is the only such deletion in the entire book. Tell me that that's not the UFO file, JFK assassination piece. So I think that gives us the picture, and I'll spice in a little more connections around McDonald and Berkman, but this really, I think, rounds things out. And then with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay, my head's spinning, quite frankly. You throw so much. So we're going to take it nice and easy into this. Okay, so where you left off, Karen Carpenter says, does DJ think Watergate was connected to aerospace industry or UFO file?
Well, there's no question about it. When you get on that level of secrecy, there's a whole piece about the assassination. And remember, the assassination is related to the UFO file. So here's what happened in Watergate. If you go through all the books and you really stretch it out, what you find out is that there was a guy named Larry O'Brien who worked for Howard Hughes. And he used to be kind of on the Nixon team. And he got recruited by the Democrats. And the Democrats, the idea was that the Democrats were going to use information that O'Brien had about Nixon's participation in a program to eliminate Fidel Castro with the CIA and Hughes, and that they had this information, and that the information related directly to something that was gone on behind the scenes with Nixon and Hughes, and then the assassination happened as a result of it. Now, later, we have Nixon questioning Helms, saying, give me all your records about what you did in the JFK assassination so I can protect you, in essence. And that tape only just came out. That's the tape where he says, because people have always said, well, he could be talking about something else. This tape, which came out, he says, the whole who shot John angle. So that, unless you can figure out another John who's assassinated that the public is interested in, I'm pretty sure they're talking about the CIA killing John Kennedy. There's something in that setup of those people and Hughes. And I think that Nixon wants to divorce himself, and he wants to know what's in those records about the actual assassination, and if the Hughes piece links back to him. So he's trying to get that information. So we have to think of Nixon and understand him as somebody who was deep in that system and was working to assassinate foreign leaders. There's even mention in there that he planned to assassinate Onassis. That's also in this article. And that he's speaking with Robert Mayhew, who was a CIA operative who was working for Hughes and will run Hughes' empire. And, they get Hughes so addicted to these painkillers and deep drugs and heroin and all the rest that they can just run his empire and use it as a CIA playground. And they take Hughes Aerospace, and it's basically CIA aerospace. But what's interesting is when Nixon is talking to Mayhew, there's a background to this where he's suggesting to Mayhew that they may have to use him to assassinate Onassis. So he's familiar with the assassination process. Nixon benefited from Bobby Kennedy's assassination, which Robert Mayhew and the Hughes organization was behind. and that CIA connection with that organization. So that much is for sure. In terms of Nixon's association with the JFK assassination, there was something back there that he didn't want on the record about him, and it had to do with Hughes and the assassination plots of foreign leaders, and that Hughes may have used with the CIA, who had taken over the Hughes organization. That's how the assassination of Kennedy may have come about. That's how they tricked the Watergate Nixon burglars into the DNC, because that information was supposed to be hanging out in a safe at the DNC. So if you go through all the pieces of Watergate, that's where you land, really, after all of it. Sure, there's stuff about a call girl ring and all that stuff, but you know that if Howard Hunt went on the record with that publicly to NBC broadcasting, I mean, that's not really what was going on there. Something much deeper was going on. Yes.
Okay, Maggie Ray. Did Berkner know Uncle John Trump?
Well, this is the interesting thing. I have them in the same organizations. I have them with the same mentor, Vannevar Bush. So the answer conditionally is yes. I don't have correspondence with Trump and Berkner, but it probably is out there. And they're both in the Rad Lab, so they certainly knew each other. How deep that friendship went is another story. But if you consider this, that Vannevar Bush is John G. Trump's mentor and actually sets him up to get the Tesla files, then you are, looking at somebody with that level of influence, and his assistant is Berkner, then you have to, you start to move into that immediately. And of course, Berkner, finding those people, working with them at MIT, the Rad Lab during that whole period. So, the Rad Lab's a pretty tight group at MIT. And so I think you're going to find a lot of crossover. The other thing is that they're both looking at radio, shortwave radio, radio waves, and radio waves is a way to map space. So I think there's probably behind the scenes a lot of collaboration. I just haven't found those very interesting letters that you often find back and forth between these people. Yes.
David Tormina. DJ, Berkner was involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence project OSMA, named for Frank Baum's Princess Ozma,
Yes.
and her radio communication to Dorothy. Was Berkner involved with the Cosmos Club?
Well, this is an interesting thing because everyone around, there's an interesting split that takes place with a lot of people, which is they're either with the American Philosophical Foundation or they're with the Cosmos Club. And sometimes you get crossovers, but mostly it's like one or the other. And so we have him at the Carnegie Institute. I mean, he's in and out of so many different groups. And we have all of the people he's working with at the Cosmos Club. I haven't yet found him at the Cosmos Club. It's probable that it's there, but it's not on the record at this point. But I mean, when you look at the things that this guy is involved with, it's extraordinary. And I think you're going to find him as a key interface point. One of the interesting things that I found about him was in a very interesting book review, and how this person is looking at the background of Berkner and saying, he doesn't have the scientific credentials here, and here, and here. So how is he getting all these positions? How is he the head of OSRD, and how is he, Office of Science, Research and Development? It's because Vannevar Bush is putting him in all these positions. But right off the bat, he is this radio whiz, and he goes to Antarctica and he sets up all these things at the age of 22. So he's on that inside track working with this group. They want him for that expertise, his secrecy, and his ability to be loyal. I think that that's important. Yes.
Kate Schneider. Also, Judy Garland called JFK every weekend to sing Over the Rainbow to JFK.
Oh,
really?
yes. Right. Exactly.
Beautiful.
You know that you're going to find the Wizard of Oz piece deep in there. But yeah, that is extraordinary. There's another thing here. Here's part of that review. Lloyd Berkner is a Zelig-like character in the world of the 20th century American science policy. Accompanied Admiral Byrd to his famous expedition, he worked at the RAD Lab, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, helping to develop radar during the Second World War. He was the key assistant to Vannevar Bush in the effort to organize military research and development after the war. He proposed convening the International Geophysical Year. These are the things we've been covering. And when you think about somebody showing up in all of those different pieces, he is, again, he's one of these people like Jessup and even deeper. But Jessup, again, is somebody who shows up, you know, and he's involved in astronomy. He's a professor of astronomy, but he's also an archaeologist. But he's also in South America, you know, extracting special beans, coffee beans. I mean, these people seem to have these multiple identities when they're connected on this track. And the track for me is the X-Share, X-Protect track. And that's where the whole piece about the hot zone network exists. So one thing I wanted to fill in is that in the official rollout of the MJ12 piece. Now, I've put on the record that a lot of things in MJ12 turned out to be real. So here's the basic story, and I spoke at length with Stanton Friedman about it before he passed away. Stanton Friedman, we really could use right now with the whole UFO file and the whole UFO field. But basically what he told me was he received all these documents in the mail, that they were sent to him directly. And that there were a few things that happened there. This other researcher he was working with got a series of them, and they traded all these documents that they had. And they realized that all the people involved now had died. And the last one who was involved in the group had just recently passed away. That's why they think they got the records. Now, there was always this thing afterwards that other ones showed up, these other MJ12 style documents, and they looked like they were propaganda or whatever. So the question has always been, it's propaganda. Now, here's what's interesting. If you go into the record, you're going to find that there are these very deep physicists who got involved and went on the record years, 30 years before MJ12 came out, saying Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file. If you go and you find in those documents of MJ12 that Stanton Friedman and other researchers got in '84, it says the same thing. So it's consistent in that sense, and it seems to reveal it. So let's just take it on face that those original MJ12 documents were real. This is what they have to say. Memorandum for the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Forrestal. This is from Harry Truman. As per our recent conversation on this matter, you are hereby authorized to proceed with all due speed and caution upon your undertaking hereafter. This matter shall be referred to only as Operation Majestic 12. The Eisenhower briefing document lists the members of Operation Majestic 12. The MJ12 members, as listed in the Eisenhower briefing document, are arranged alphabetically because one member died soon after MJ12 was officially established, so the total would be 13. Number 1 in the listing is Dr. Lloyd Veal Berkner. That's an interesting thing about his middle name, too. I have to get into some naming conventions. V-I-E-L. How interesting. But he's number 1, scientist explorer, first executive director of the Joint Research and Development Board, World War II era, an expert on ionization and on radar, engaged in atmospheric pollution studies at the time of his death. Now, Vannevar Bush is listed number 3. So their top man in those documents, he's listed as number 1. Think about that. Then this is interesting. The 3 hours that he spent with McDonald, there are no records of it, which is strange because McDonald was meticulous about records. What I did find at a library in Arizona was the Lloyd Berkner and the visit that he had and the date of it, April 15th, 1967. They have box 2. Now, I contacted the library to see if they had the documents and what were in there, and if I could get a copy of what was in there. Now, this can go either way. One of the things that I did with Miss Olivia a few years ago was we went to MIT, and the John G. Trump X box was there. And, it turned out that that box was marked X, just like the X steganography. And you would think, well, there's going to be some very interesting things. But of course, there was nothing of value in there. So unfortunately, when it comes to these things, you don't know. But I have asked, and we will see if there's anything important in that McDonald file. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, does DJ expect more success with the release of X letters and files than with the Kennedy files?
Well, this is the interesting. We have to understand them as stealth archives. Look, there's a whole study now that the Rockefellers did in the 50s, from 55 to 59, and it was all about every aspect of culture. Hunger, upwardly mobile versus, the ghetto, and all these different cultural factors. And those studies were very deep, and many of them were done right here at Harvard. And they had these meetings over the course of a couple of years, and Henry Kissinger was one of the main people who headed up the committees before he was involved with Nixon and all this other stuff. Now, here's what's interesting about it, which is it was learned that one of the main pieces of that was the study of UFOs. Well, they released their findings on all the other things in a series of books in the late 50s. Oh, the economic status of so-and-so, and this about minorities and all the rest of it. But there was never anything published about the UFO meetings. So no one ever knew, hey, who was in charge of that and all the rest of it. So this UFO researcher who tracked down a lot of very interesting information and wrote a book about the Aztec UFO crash, he found out that the person who had worked on that said Henry Kissinger ran the whole thing. So Kissinger is in the know on the UFO file, working for the Rockefellers, putting that whole study together. But that study does exist. In fact, it's part of the Rockefeller archives, but it's not accessible to the public. So it's another stealth archive. So the LBJ X-Letter, you can't get your hands on it. The Rockefeller UFO study, you can't get your hands on it. The JFK assassination files, the CIA holds them. So there's a series of stealth archives. And whenever I've gone into it, there's something like 160 that I've identified. And the way that it operates is very interesting. They need to be out there. They represent a kind of leverage and a kind of transparency that could happen. And so therefore a danger to a certain group. And therefore they're able to maintain this, kind of like, hey, we're open, about that there's files, but they always keep the leverage going, and it's a never ending game. And so, I was reading a book from 1991 on the Kennedy assassination. And it was a guy, William Turner and Warren Hinkle did a book together. And what's interesting to me is that they're talking about the JFK records that could come out. And I was like, oh my God, think about it. They're running this game 30 years ago, so, and if you go back even further, those guys were in 91. If you go into the 60s or something, how long ago is that? So this game goes on, and you get opportunities maybe to bring transparency out about it. It seems to me there's something going on in the background on the JFK CIA files where the CIA is about to be embarrassed from the outside. So they're considering some kind of release that they can spin, oh, there was mafia involved, so we couldn't talk about it, but it wasn't us. So they have no intention of exploring or sharing that information. The CIA never shares any important information with the public, ever. They'd never share the UFO file in a million years. So when you got those very accomplished UFO researchers lining up and saying the CIA is going to share disclosure, it was a weird parade, especially since most of those guys, and I've talked about them before, they're made their whole career on, hey, we're anti-government, that government's holding things back from us. And then CIA shows up and says, hey, we're going to do the UFO threat thing and fight that government and all that. They're all CIA people. And there was the attempt with Elizondo, of course, the whole To the Stars Academy piece, and he's still out there, but he has to lay low because he did such a bad job. But they did a whole thing with Elizondo, which was very interesting because when he came out, they had to say he was an ex-Pentagon official. But now that whole story that they laid out, and they had him on everything from Fox, and all the UFO shows had him, and everybody had this guy on. GQ made him Hero of the Year. That's a real stretch. But what was interesting to me is that his whole thing was that he was an ex-Pentagon person. But it had turned out that something that we said right off the bat, which is why he didn't want to have a gentleman's debate here on this program, and he was offered to, and he can still come on and do that if he wants, is that he was working for the Pentagon and the CIA during this whole time. So there was no ex anything. So Leslie Kean and all those people that created this New York Times story about the UFO whistleblower, ex-Pentagon official, and Chris Mellon, who supported it, it was all BS because he was still working for them. So he wasn't ex anything. That's the first lie. The second lie was that the Tic Tac video was some original video. And, those videos, one of those videos had already come out on YouTube 10 years ago, or no, 2007. Was that 15 years ago? So, these were the lies that are allowed to spread through the media, and they pumped them up. Wired magazine and that whole infrastructure of stuff, New York Times, Politico, CBS. I mean, they all bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they tried to push this guy on it. It didn't work, but they tried, and they'll try again. They'll try it with Gary Nolan. That's the one that they're working with next. Yes, Miss Olivia.
The weed in your garden. Question: did Indrid Cold exist, and if so, what happened to him? Did he meet with LBJ?
Well, look, Indrid Cold's very important because he comes out of the whole incredible sightings that happened in West Virginia, and in 66 and 67. That's where the whole Mothman thing came out. And John Keel did an incredible exploration of those sightings, and everyone was seeing this stuff. He saw the stuff, and he had people calling him, Keel did, on the phone and telling him what the next, sighting was going to occur, and, giving him information. And they were speaking in this weird electronic garbled voice, but they were giving him information. And they were calling his hotel rooms as he would show up and book at a hotel room. He'd get in there and they'd call him. How did they get his number? So they were tracking him. But Indrid Cold plays into this story. There's a guy named Woody Dornberger, and Woody had an experience where he was driving on the highway during this period, and he sees a UFO land on the highway. And he thinks that it's a plane in distress or something. It's small, like a small plane. And he pulls over. And what's interesting is that there are witnesses who saw him and the UFO and just kept driving. So, there were legitimate witnesses on the scene. And the person comes out, and he is, human, but he acts very strangely. And he introduces himself as Indrid Cold, and he says, "Oh, I'm from another planet," and all this really far out stuff. And now, if you track into that story a little bit, Woody is so freaked out that he goes and he reports to the police, and then he's on TV like the next night telling his story, and his life goes very upside down after that. But his daughter, if you kind of read the background on that, the daughter will say that Indrid Cold did go and show up at his house and made a big impression, and that people became very curious about Indrid Cold. So whoever that was, it was a real person, whether they were masquerading, with a high technology ship and landing on a highway and just kind of doing a psyop in this guy is anybody's guess, or it could have been something else. But whatever it was, there's enough witnesses around it that I think the answer would have to be, yes, it was real. The LBJ thing, I don't know, but I'll tell you that LBJ became very curious about the idea that a UFO had caused a blackout in 1965. That's kind of interesting. That shows the depth and the level of his own knowledge around the UFO file. Yes.
Okay, so let's go back to Antarctica.
Yes, wait, hold on one second. I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 142, deep here on the Nixon LBJ UFO file. Lloyd Berkner, what a surprise. What a surprise. Meeting President Kennedy at the Dallas Trade Mart, but he never got to the meeting. So we've uncovered some things and put them on the record about that meeting. Absolutely astounding. It's great to be here with so many of you. And we're going to take now a few more questions, and I'll try to pepper in a few things here, and we'll go for about another 15 minutes.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right.
Okay, Kate Schneider says, so strange that Fletcher Prouty, Mr. X, was suddenly sent down to Antarctica right before JFK was killed.
Yes.
Do you want to go into that story?
This is important because what happens with Prouty, remember Prouty is Mr. X, who's giving Garrison all this information behind the scenes. Prouty talks about how he's getting reports from pilots about UFOs. So there's a whole UFO thing around Prouty. And there's another piece with him in the UFO file, which is that in 1997, he put out a popular book, I think it's in 1977, called The Secret Team. And it's all about the JFK assassination. And he had been the liaison between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA. So he was right there at that pivot point. And after the JFK assassination, he got out in 1964. But what's interesting is the story that he tells about what they did with him shortly before the assassination, which is his commanding officer, who's Ed Lansdale, says, and Ed Lansdale was classic for doing all these, showing up in these countries, and suddenly the government was overthrown, and he had to organize the new government that was coming in. But he was an Air Force CIA guy that they used for deep black ops, and he went all the way back. There's a Farrell story about Lansdale and his team interrogating and torturing the chauffeur of the Emperor of Japan, looking for this hidden stash of gold. So Lansdale is very deep there. And what he tells Prouty is that you're going to the South Pole, you're going to Antarctica, because we have some important diplomats that you need to shuttle there. And he said, okay. And the whole time he's befuddled by why, this kind of low-level thing of him accompanying these diplomats to Antarctica. But while he's out and away, the assassination happens. He's on his way back in New Zealand, and he opens up the newspaper and he sees the whole bio of Oswald and all the rest of it. And when he did the math and checked with his sources when he came back, the story had already been broadcast before they had charged Oswald with the crime. So none of it made sense. He understood black ops because having worked in the CIA and the Joint Chiefs, how to put out a black op. So he's like, oh my God, they're doing a black op with Oswald and saying, this guy was in Russia. This guy, has this whole background. He was the Fair Play for Cuba committee, and, just painting him with this brush immediately. And so he realizes something was wrong. Then he realizes that one of the things that he would have been charged with is the security for the president on the trip. And he realizes all the gaps from not setting up the security. And he went there and he saw the security stripping from the Secret Service. And he talks about, how that's an art, how they protect the president. And they would have never allowed all those open windows and all the rest of it. So that's how he kind of comes into this. And what's fascinating is there's a famous picture of these tramps walking by, and these, cops taking these tramps in. And the tramps have always been mysterious and disappeared. And they were caught in the rail yard behind the Texas School Book Depository. And what's weird is that if you look at them, they are pretty well dressed for tramps. And one of them's a pretty young guy. So in the picture, there's a guy going by, and he showed it to all these people. They had worked with Lansdale for years. He had worked with Lansdale for years. And his basic thing was, that's Ed Lansdale. What you find that's interesting in relation to this is that Lansdale had officially resigned only 3 weeks before the assassination. So there he is walking around in Dealey Plaza near these people who are just pulled out of this train. And the idea basically is that Lansdale is saying, keep it cool, don't blow it. We'll get you out of that. And they do. They let them go, in fact.
And there's no record of them.
Right. What they try to do when a lot of things were happening in the 90s, they were getting nervous and they trotted these guys out and they were like, hey, I was the tramp, and CBS News loved that. And they were like, oh, yeah, don't you just hate these conspiracies? And he was like, oh, yeah, And they had this guy who didn't look anything like anybody in those pictures. And they just, they do this once in a while. They did that with the Umbrella Man, too. Mm-hmm. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking more of your questions here. And I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. It's very important for us, especially if you're new, to keep that, kind of communication going so that we don't experience the type of social media censorship that we've been seeing and the de-amplifying, as they call it in the Twitter files. And basically with that, it keeps you on board with the incredible things that we have coming up. We have great interviews and shows coming up for you, including Gigi Young, who I think is out there in the chat.
She is indeed.
Gigi's coming up shortly, and fantastic interviews with Gigi and others coming up for January and February. Be in the know. Make sure you get that newsletter. Yes.
Okay. Alien scientist, could the UFO materials have been brought to Antarctica, or do you think there's still a, quote, blue room at Wright Pat? Simone Nyman says, is Antarctica the real Area 51? And Harry Honkinen says, is the UFO file actually about the Nazi Antarctica operation?
Yeah, well, that's all very interesting. Here's a piece there, which is, remember that the Nazis hired Admiral Byrd for their Antarctica explorations. They hired him in 1938 before we were actually at war with them. But it's still strange. And they loved him. They gave him awards, just like Henry Ford. Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford in his office. So, they kind of roll out the red carpet and he teaches them all about, hey, here's what you do about Antarctica. I don't know what the American authorities felt about Byrd going over there and doing that. But at the time, we weren't in any problems with Germany. Although if you look at it, there's the whole Munich peace appeasement conference that happens because they haven't stopped Hitler from rolling in everywhere. And what he does is he rolls into Austria with the Anschluss, and he's unopposed. So it's not a bloody war. And what they do is they're like, they get together with him, and Neville Chamberlain famously, gets a signed paper from Hitler saying, hey, I won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. And so there's all these things that go on, and he comes back and he waves this paper, and then Hitler rolls in, and they have to go to war. So appeasement, becomes the route to World War II. But in 1938, it's pretty interesting for him to be over there. So that's what first popped into my head when you're talking about the Nazis and Antarctica. I think there's something much deeper than Nazis involved there. I had a guy named Richard Miller, Dr. Miller. He's a very interesting guy. And I did a show with him years ago, but he was somebody that the CIA had used for different things. And one of the things that he was involved in was Antarctica. And the two things that he let out about it was that they found some kind of like 14th century, almost like a Viking outlet there at Antarctica. That was one. And the other one was they had the remains of some kind of a Nazi enclave there. What we do know is that Byrd in 1947 did Operation High Jump and had to get out of there early. Now, he'd already gone to Antarctica. He'd already, been involved in these things, but he comes back freaked out, and he leaves something like 2 months early. He's supposed to be down there. And he says, you won't believe the stuff that we encountered. And that's where all the rumors come out about Byrd. So he encountered something down there. And it could be that, there was a UFO base there. Who was operating it is a good question. What was the rest of that? I think that was basically, I hope that was a satisfying answer, but yes.
Sorry. Saturday night is troll night.
Saturday night's all right for fighting, right? Yes.
Okay, Timothy guessing. Does DJ think the first CIA director, Roscoe, is it Hillenkoetter or Helen Curter? How do you,
Yes.
was
Hillenkoetter.
X-Share?
Yes, I do. I'm glad you mentioned him. I have a section I didn't get to tonight. I'll try to roll this into, I sent some episodes coming up on Berkner and all the rest. But here is Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. And he's the vice admiral. And he became he wanted the UFO file to be public. And he works with NICAP. And he develops this whole program. And NICAP becomes the place where Donald Kehoe in the 50s people, Thomas Townsend Brown is a leader of NICAP. So you have great people in the original NICAP. What happens is they spook him, but I'll read this because this will give you an idea of McDonald and Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Okay, McDonald's entrance into the UFO research field revived hopes for open congressional hearings. He was personally acquainted with powerful congressmen and other government officials, including both of the Udells from Arizona. Mo Udell was kind of a big shot down there. He was fully aware of the difficulties. He questioned Kehoe about Admiral Hillenkoetter's inexplicable about-face, which had helped destroy the 1962 UFO hearings plan. What happened was, after Hillenkoetter had a decade of pumping up the UFO file and trying to get hearings, out of the blue, he says, "In my opinion, NICAP's investigation has gone as far as possible. I know UFOs are not U.S. or Soviet devices. The Air Force cannot do any more under the circumstances, and I believe we should not continue to criticize their investigations." The flat statement negated a great part of NICAP's work in the eyes of the congressman, and the hearing plans collapsed. Kehoe and all NICAP members were astounded at the setback. And McDonald had been banking on this whole thing happening. McDonald's lobbying is a masterful example of how to work the halls of Congress. His journal gives complete details of the convoluted process he undertook, and he gets these UFO talks to happen. Now, I think that he was an ex-share person along with T.T. Brown and others. And I think Kehoe is in that. And I also think that Berkner is in that. But Berkner has an official position, so he can't, these other guys have official positions as well. Hillenkoetter, in fact, was the first CIA director. So Truman wanted him. And if you think about that, it's quite interesting because it was Dulles who wanted the CIA in the first place, and he got to be director in 1953 under Eisenhower. But even though they got the CIA going, Truman wanted like a real military person in there and not a shady S&C lawyer. This is also interesting. It's kind of a sidebar on that. That's a picture of Harry Truman with Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards wrote Flying Saucer Serious Business, Men in Black, all this stuff.
What are they doing together?
They're hanging out, and there's a dedication there on the picture. It's like, to my good friend Frank Edwards from Harry Truman, keep doing it. And he knew Truman for years. So, there's a UFO network operating there, and occasionally you get glimpses of it. I have pictures of Eisenhower with Kenneth Arnold. And Kenneth Arnold, for sure, was running for governor. But wouldn't you think the guy with the most famous UFO sighting in the world would be radioactive? For the president? No, apparently not. He's there hugging him, throwing flags with him, and everything else. So, the UFO thing was moving there in the 50s. And what happened is the subjugation of the topic became more and more, like X-Protect got more and more powerful, if anything. But Hillenkoetter is a key aspect of that whole thing because he was all for transparency around the thing. Great point mentioning him. Yes, Ms.
Mirror
Olivia.
13, off topic, but is DJ looking into the Russian report of shooting down a UFO the other day?
I have it right here. Yeah. I'll tell you what's more important than if it was an actual UFO is the fact that the Russians are now using the term "we shot down a UFO," to put it on the record. So they're saying, look, we know the UFO thing is being activated. Basically, we know you guys have UFOs, and we know that there are UFOs. So we're just going to start using the terminology. And if you're going to, be supporting Ukraine on the level that you are, and we're enemies, then we're just going to start opening up things. Watch for really key blackmail coming out of Russia in relation to deep state activities, 9/11 and the JFK assassination. They're very aware because of their own intelligence outreach. Now, I've spoken a lot before about the Russia-Ukraine situation, and I don't, nothing that Russia is doing in Ukraine, it's not defensible. But our attitude and our approach to the Russians is not defensible either. And so it's an incredible lack of a peace process. And one thing I will say in Putin's defense, even though he's the aggressor in this situation, he did ask, he said, I'm ready for talks and all the rest of it. And we just had given all these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to Zelensky. And what does Zelensky do? He turns around and says, there will be no peace, like we're coming at you. And so that's not the way to do it. But, if he says, yeah, let's have a peace process, all the money dries up. Lockheed Martin doesn't get paid off. Boeing doesn't get paid off. Zelensky, the comedian, doesn't get paid off. So this is how they're running that situation. So yeah, do they have a real invasion from Russia on that? Yes, but there are things in that process that we could have done very differently. For example, the idea of not putting a threat on, of NATO on their doorstep. So that whole process, whatever anyone thinks of it, it needs a peace process. And if they're open to that, then we should have a robust peace process. Where is it? We have the worst Secretary of State in history, Anthony Blinken. He's a disaster. The defense secretary, he's only interested in mandatory vaccine shots. All right. He doesn't have any peace process either. What are these people made of? They don't want a peace process. That's why there isn't one. And it's tough too, because in the media, they don't care. Usually the media is, the public has a sentiment. They don't want war. They don't want these people dying, but the media is just like, hey, Zelensky's coming over here and he's wearing his blue jeans. Like this is a video game or a reality show. That's not any way to run a foreign policy. And that's something I think we could change the conversation on in 2023. Yes.
Okay. On Destroyer, DOD ran the COVID op too. Are there aerospace connections in the biopharma op?
Yeah, I'm actually.
Could you talk about the biosurveillance state?
There's a lot in there that's going to develop in some of the episodes we have coming up. But what I will say is that the transhumanist aspect is intricately tied in with the space domination, because the idea is that you would be a biosurveilled person, and the only way you can do that surveillance is from monitor, the same way that they do GPS and all the rest of it. That stuff is from satellites in space. That's all there is to it. So they call it low Earth orbit. That's where they have those. But this plan is very old, and I think what we started with LBJ saying, hey, how do you dominate things on planet Earth? You dominate it from space, is very telling about where they were coming from originally. I have a couple more quotes actually on that front. Here's a quote, and this goes to Paris Flamand, who I think gives us a lot around the UFO. He did UFO books and he did JFK books, and he worked on them very differently. But his book series, I was finally able to track down. But let me tell you, the information involved in his work is astounding. Here's something that he puts, I think, on the record that's worthwhile. On June 7th, the United Nations Outer Space Affairs Group heard an address by James McDonald on the subject of unidentified flying objects, during which the physicist summarized his views. According to Major Kehoe, in 1959, NICAP had promised the names of key witnesses and proof of the censorship of the Senate Preparedness Committee run by Senator Lyndon Johnson. Nothing definite, but his staff is looking into it. They're worried about Lyndon Johnson. He reports a Washington newsman told him, afraid he might order hearings before they can knock down these airline reports, primarily Killian's. Regarding Congress, at least 18 senators and 50 representatives have expressed their interests in UFOs or allied research. Now, I'm going to break that down. Basically, in 1959, LBJ is threatening to use the Senate and the what they call the Senate Preparedness Committee to investigate UFOs. That's a large-scale investigation. And these, what they have here is that the military and the establishment is worried about him doing that. Now, this is interesting because I don't think for a minute that he wanted to bring any transparency, but he knew he had leverage. This is, Senator NASA had the leverage. And his involvement with the UFO file goes back, is right in the heart of things, as we see. So these things start to make a little more sense. The other thing I wanted to show, and this is quite remarkable, but it's very, it gives us kind of an idea of Flamon's depth. All right, now this letter has been checked out as coming from Robert Kennedy. This is very interesting, and there was people who looked into it and found that Robert Kennedy had sent a number of letters relating to inquiries about the UFO file. Gray Barker, the man who brought the whole UFO file, Men in Black thing, had written to RFK. And this is the letter that he said he got back. Now, someone who worked with Gray Barker said that, in fact, they got this response on it. So he backed him up on it, and Flamond thought it was legitimate enough to put in his book, and there it is. So I'm going to read this response from Robert Kennedy to Gray Barker. So Robert Kennedy, United States Senate, May 9th, 1968. Remember that he will be assassinated June 5th. Gray Barker, publisher, Saucer News, Clarksburg, West Virginia. Dear Mr. Barker, as you know, I'm a card-carrying member of the Amalgamated Flying Saucers Association. Doesn't this sound like a hoax? Immediately you would think couldn't be, and yet here it is. Therefore, like many other people in our country, I'm interested in the phenomenon of flying saucers. It is a fascinating subject that has initiated both scientific fiction fantasies and serious scientific research. I watch with great interest all reports of unidentified flying objects, and I hope that someday we'll know more about this intriguing subject. Dr. Harlow Shapley, the prominent astronomer, has stated that there is a probability that there is other life in the universe. I favor more research regarding this matter, and I hope that once and for all you can determine the true facts about flying saucers. Your magazine can stimulate much of the investigation and inquiry into the phenomenon through the publication of news and discussion material. This can be of great help in paving the way to a knowledge of one of the most fascinating subjects of our contemporary world. And then they have that famous signature of Robert Kennedy with an X. So I did, it's quite an interesting letter, and it's got the formality of RFK, but it's still remarkable that it's even out there and that it's real. So I went on a little hunt for other RFK letters around the UFO file, and in fact, they exist. And he says things very much like that, which are kind of non-committal, but sort of show his interest in the subject. So RFK, who Philip Corso said he briefed on a regular, said he briefed both President Kennedy and RFK on a regular basis in relation to the UFO file. And we know that at a certain point, working for the Foreign Technology Office, he was deeply involved with it. And, he's the guy who put out The Day After Roswell. He passed away. He was an older guy who was ill, but that book had some interesting, it's very hard to look at that book and dismiss it, because Corso was everywhere that he said he was, and you could find him working with General Trudeau, and he's in all these different positions exactly as he said. So the question is, what's the level? Is he exaggerating or whatever? But if he's not, then there's a great opening there in what he let out. And as I understand it, he had more to let out. Yes.
Karen Carpenter's asking, so it's a real RFK letter?
Well, it's interesting. The letter was circulating back here, now 1971 in the book. Gray Barker said he got the letter in response to his sending a letter to Robert Kennedy. Other people around the UFO topic sent letters to RFK, and they got a response. And it was kind of the same type of response. I think the only interesting thing there is he makes kind of a joke at the beginning, like, hey, I'm a card-carrying saucer, follower. But the rest of the format of the letter all looks normal. And the person who was working with Barker said, oh yeah, he didn't hoax that. He got a letter back, basically. So, take it or leave it, I suppose you could look at it. But Flamand, if you look at the level that he publishes things on, you wouldn't think he'd include it unless it was legit. It doesn't really reveal anything except an interest on RFK's part, which he did. There are actually, at the Kennedy Library, there's something like a half dozen letters. And I printed out some of them. They're just letters. One of them is from someone who is the son of someone who was involved in Roswell. And what's weird about this is nobody even knew about Roswell at that point, because remember, they had a Roswell blackout from 1947 to 1979. And nobody even heard anything about it except that one article that went out, and then, weather balloon, and that's it. And then you don't find it in any of the literature. So it takes Stanton Friedman interviewing Jesse Marcel, who says, yeah, this happened to me 30 years ago, for it to get on the record again in the 80s. And by the 90s, you have a big Roswell. Everyone's talking about it, right? But they've had 30 years to cycle it through. But this guy who writes to Robert Kennedy in one of the letters that I've seen was the son of somebody who was involved in the Roswell incident. And he says, I think the Air Force is covering this up. And RFK says to him, well, I don't have any evidence that they're covering it up, but, I'll look into it, basically. And he gives him a very kind of straight political answer, but he doesn't blow him off and say, you're a weirdo who believes in UFOs and, forget about it. So I think that Kennedy, can't do too much in public, but I think the letter to Barker has to be about as open as anything. And again, it's in Flamand's book, for what it's worth. I don't think it reveals too much, but it's kind of his ease with the subject, I think, shows that they were very comfortable with the UFO topic. Yes.
Zach Robinson says it's like living in an X-Files episode.
You have to know it's true. I'm going to throw out a couple of weird things here that I found along the way, and then we'll wrap up this episode. By the way, everyone's been fantastic. What a great crowd. And it's great to kick off 2023 with everyone here in the ideas room. And Miss Olivia just knocking them dead with the questions. Unbelievable.
Everybody's saying it's a stellar episode.
Well, why do you think they interfered with it last night? That's the question. All right. 1961, there's a guy named the Honorable Leonard G. Wolf. He's a congressman. He's a one-term congressman. And he's in from 59 to 61 of Iowa. Here's what he says to the House of Representatives. Congressman. Wednesday, August 31st, 1960. Mr. Wolf. We know a Mr. Wolf out there. Mr. Speaker, under leave to extend my remarks, I include an urgent warning by Vice Admiral R.H. Hillenkotter, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, that certain potential dangers are linked with unidentified flying objects, UFOs. The Admiral's request that Congress inform the public as to the facts is endorsed by more than 200 pilots, rocket, aviation, and radar experts, astronomers, military veterans, and other technically trained members of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Among them, Rear Admiral H.B. Knowles. He goes on this huge list of people. The list goes on. The list goes on. Let's see if I have the rest of this. He goes, it is of first importance to confirm these objects the business of government to take a hand, if only to avoid the danger of a global tragedy. If we persist in refusing to recognize the existence of these UFOs, we will end up one fine day by mistaking them for the guided missiles of an enemy, and the worst will be upon us. Here he is raising the nuclear threat aspect that JFK raises in his memo, saying, I want the UFO files so we can avoid this with the Soviets. I'm going to create a sharing program. Today, this danger may surpass the one cited in NICAP's report. The UBSE might spread false rumors that the UFOs are secret red devices, that is, Russian ships, which have mapped all the US and allied targets and could be used as a surprise attack weapon. Some Americans already suspect hidden fear of UFOs as the reason for the secrecy. We are sure you will agree it is imperative to end the risk of accidental war from defense forces, confusion over UFOs. All defense personnel, not merely top-level groups, should be told that UFOs are real, should be trained to distinguish them by their characteristic speeds and maneuvers from conventional planes and missiles. This is not in effect today. Second, the American people must be convinced by documented facts that UFOs could not be Russian machines. This is a congressman addressing Congress in 1960. So the UFO file was on the move. The X-Share group was on the move. By the way, this guy only serves 2 years in Congress. And in 1961, he runs again and he doesn't get in. And then that's it. No more of him. And then 5 years later, he dies. But, and he dies pretty young too. I think he died at 40 years old. But, basically, while he was a congressman, that's pretty impressive to put on the record, I would say. And he gives a lot of background, frankly, on it. And he cites cases. So his address to Congress, and it's so much about Congress in the air relating to the speakership and all the things that have happened. But think about if somebody stood up in that congressional office and said, there before all of Congress, here's the real deal. We need the truth about the UFO file, and we don't need this kind of CIA mumbo jumbo and Elizondo and all that kind of thing. So, it just gives us room to reflect. And then when we speak about that, we realize, JFK killed over the UFO file. Now, it's a little more resonant if you think about it. Here's the congressman addressing it in 1960. Here's the struggle going on that is so hidden when we look at it, when in retrospect, when they go back and they look at this, they don't really see that piece about JFK and the UFO file. The whole thing about the JFK records is they're going to reveal an aerospace piece in this. That's what the problem is for their part. I mean, it shows the UFO piece in relation to the aerospace problem, and it shows the CIA culpabilities in the UFO file. So that is, that gets us into, I think, a totally different level. Miss Olivia, last question.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna throw these two out, and you can. I think you can answer them both. Okay. So Mr. Monaco wants to know: do you believe that the world is ready for disclosure? And Timothy Guessing is asking you: would you meet with a group of aliens operating in the United States if you could?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, of course. To the second question. The first question is, honesty is a good policy. Honesty has a resonance to it. People can accept honesty. So it may cause, they already did studies. The Brookings Institute did a study, and that was in 1961 on the impact of the knowledge of extraterrestrial life. And they came to mixed conclusions, but one of the things they said was, it would destroy religion, which I don't think is true at all. But I think the problem is the secrecy involved, and what you're looking at is people utilizing people's interests and then creating scenarios for them to be, their attitudes to be harvested into a control system. That's why the UFO threat piece is so dangerous to us. And, they whipped it up really hard. They couldn't pull it off. They trotted it out during the whole COVID lockdown thing. That was weird. The things that they've done around it, they fumbled the ball a few times, but they got it into the National Defense Authorization Act, along with $800 billion for the military. That's nice, huh? Technically, I don't know. Are we at war? I missed that part. $800 billion? That's just what's on the record. Come on. But I think when you look at it, if you take the honesty piece, then yes, you can have disclosure. And I think it can be a whole thing about moving the culture forward. And, you'd have ups and downs with it like everything, but it's a much better proposition than a small group holding a massive amount of technology and creating weird psyops and controlling the world. And now, having trains of satellites around it, nobody says anything. Well, it's all the cost of doing business. There's this guy who's running Twitter, and he's also running satellites in space. He's also running SpaceX, and he's also boring, under tunnels under Las Vegas and stuff. I mean, the nature of the problem here is that this is something that needs to be society-wide, all of these choices, and to just launch into it and be like, you're going to be digitally tracked. These satellites are going to be following you. By the way, you can't see the night sky anymore because of the satellites. And we've created a space infrastructure. It goes back to the fact of the lack of accountability all the way back. And when we are looking at the JFK assassination and then Watergate on the other side, the way that those things were handled, and that the media left all the important things on the cutting room floor, that's why we get into a situation. That's why you have an idiotic media now.
And at the root of all of it,
yes.
And I think it's very obvious now, is the central banks. Because we can't move our money around. We can't defund this or that because there's just one big banking infrastructure and we're locked into it.
No question.
It's so obvious.
Absolutely. It's an interesting thing. I think what you want to do is you want to put the pieces on the table. And a major piece on the table is the real aspect around the UFO file and the political skullduggery that's taking place around it. That's crucial. The aerospace role in these deep events, that's also crucial. And then, we have somebody like Berkner, who we've looked at, who was involved in setting up radio at Antarctica and involved in the development of the Hadron Collider style particle accelerators and the head of Brookhaven Nuclear Lab for 10 years. This is somebody who is deep and with those connections. And so it gives us an idea that there's a whole different structure and leadership structure that's operational around issues which we don't know very much about. I mean, Antarctica, literally we know very little because of the nature of how they've kept it. And the fact that it's so remote that, this is an interesting thing I say about the hot zone, which is, the coast of Florida is right there. Bimini is there. Cuba is there. Like, these things are a little easier to get our hands on. And I think there's a powerful way to extract information about ancient civilizations and the true story of humanity. Magnetic studies and all these different pieces of the puzzle, like T.T. Brown was doing when he would go to San Antonio, Cuba. So, for me, it's very accessible. Antarctica is very strange. As a matter of fact, I think of the Berkner thing as kind of an opening on it. At least, we understand something about it. But why did they name submerged islands after Berkner? He has a real island in Antarctica that's above water, Why is the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository the cousin of the person who, did the expeditions to Antarctica? It's quite unusual. So I think when we get to those things, we can find very fundamental connections that form the roots, the deep basis of the system that has grown up. And that system has grown parallel with the actual system. This is the thing I think that Peter Scott gets to, and it's very important. But when you get around, you think about Joseph Farrellsworth and the bearer bonds scandals and that secret system of finance and the gold deposits and things like that, you realize there's something there's something that's operational side by side with the typical system that you and I live in every day. And the problem is that the difference between the two has become so hardcore that leadership structure now is just screaming at you for submission. And, we're kind of looking behind the curtain and saying, well, you haven't let out a lot of these things. And they're hoping they can come in with these different emergencies and centralize that kind of control. So this is the nature of the scene that we're in. The reason that we may learn so much by studying, this LBJ JFK Nixon piece around the UFO file is that's a very, very deep secret that they've kept for a long time. And if we can bring that stuff forward and, open it up, as the whole meeting between Berkner and Kennedy that was set up at the Dallas Trade Mart, what was the nature of that? And since we know that the speech that's put out there is a fake one that LBJ provided, where's the real speech? So I think that these things can be opened up in 2023. And the letter I sent to Speaker McCarthy, was basically provides them with groundwork and a cover to do it. Basically, they could say, well, this guy suggested that when we open the JFK files, we look for the UFO thing since we're doing congressional hearings on UFOs. Hey, why not? So that for me, that, there's enough of an opening in that letter to do it. But I don't, do I think that they'll do it? I don't, but I think it's possible. Yes.
Jeffrey Halsey says, is DJ aware that China purchased Bird Key adjacent to the Bahamas AUTEC?
Oh, there's so much Chinese ownership. Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's funny because when I was trying to find this place where T.T. Brown, a relative of T.T. Brown, had told me they had stayed. And let's say it's near Nassau. And I found the whole thing had become a headquarters for a Chinese, basically like a virtual reality company that China had, invested in. And this was their headquarters, and they dominated the whole thing. So any scraps of, where those buildings were originally or what was going on was, it's complete Chinese ownership down there. So that's on the move. My God. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay. I have so many super chatters to thank. Yes. So I'm going to thank everybody from last night as well as tonight. So Gillenjoy R, Joker 23, Jim Sarge 3ID, Karen Carpenter, Chris Stanger, Bill Mayo, Katarina, Eurythmia's Fun, Erica Swenson Elliott, Circle 9 Trade, Slow Time, THP 3 Free, Robert Scott, WC Ray, Wait a Minute 72, Red Panda Koala, Maggie Smith, Daniel Foster, Undestroyer, Mark Lane, Occult Fan, Norman Smith, Adam Huglow, Stefan Vanderlaan, Atlantis is Found, Doreen Hewitt, John Lavalette, Number 6, Daryl Roberts, Giselle H., Max Lupo, Father Wolf's 1, Court McQuire, Les Scott, Catherine Rorden, Vlasta FF, Calvin Center, Paul Varchek, The Weed in Your Garden, Happy Hermit 3D, Christopher Lombardo, Ayorke 01, Neil Bauman, James Lucid, Kit N, Doyle Wayne, and Johnny Ricardo Bown. Thank you so much. And Luke Walker just donated also. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luke. Wow. Let's all press. What does he have to say here? I can show it. Cheeky question, free to ignore. Does X Protect and X Share use any kind of numerology, gematria, and how they communicate? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. When you get into anything having to do with, say, the mystical arts and intelligence, you're dealing in X Protect territory. As a matter of fact, the whole Men in Black thing, I pegged on the X Protect side as an astral agency, that they were utilizing people who were good at astrally projecting, which is why the Men in Black came out so weird. So there are reasons for that have to do with the whole Laplander John Keel find. But it's an excellent question. In fact, I'm going to close the night with a quote from Joseph Farrell's book on the JFK assassination and Coalescence of Interests, the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, LBJ and the conspiracy. This is very interesting because what Farrell does is he puts LBJ in the category of one of the witnesses on the witness death list. And I think that's a really edgy thing to do, but let's see his motivations for this, or his reasoning around this. So it may seem unusual, even impertinent, to include President Lyndon Johnson in this list of dead witnesses, especially as one intention of this book is to scrutinize rather closely his probable role at some level within the conspiracy. However, in the truest sense, Lyndon Johnson was a witness, for he was in the motorcade in Dallas on a trip that he had personally helped to plan and organize. heard the shots that killed his predecessor, the shots that impelled him into the presidency and into a role that, at a minimum, forced him to act on behalf of the cover-up as an accessory after the fact, and maybe a lot more. Johnson came from a family that on his father's side suffered a history of heart ailments. Johnson himself had suffered a nearly fatal heart attack in the 50s when he was the Democratic majority leader in the United States Senate. On January 20th, 1973, Johnson was found dead of a heart attack on his ranch in Texas. Giving a president with a history of chronic heart ailments a heart attack is a very convenient way to get rid of a problem without drawing suspicion to the death itself. But was Johnson, like so many others, silenced for his role in and knowledge of aspects of the conspiracy? On April 24th, 1975, on the CBS Nightly News, then anchorman Walter Cronkite aired a portion of an interview he had conducted with President Johnson on his ranch in September 1969. Cronkite asked very directly if Johnson thought the assassination could have been the work of a conspiracy. In a short answer of little over a minute's length, Johnson replied that he did think it could have been such. Later, Johnson asked CBS to edit out that portion of the interview for national security purposes. The fact that Johnson would first talk on record and then later request CBS not to air that portion of the interview may have sent shockwaves through the groups that had a possible role within the plot. For one thing, Johnson was directly connected to almost all of them. As Senate Majority Leader, he had direct hands in the passing of the law that created NASA, exactly, and not only was a close friend of Hoover, but also a close friend of former Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. He was a close political associate of Texas oil magnates H.K. Hunt and Clint Murchison, both of whom were heavy financial contributors to his political campaigns through his aide, Bobby Baker. Johnson also had direct ties to the mafia. In his various public statements concerning the Kennedy conspiracy, Johnson fingered or implicated almost every possible group, the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and so on. By the time Johnson talked to Cronkite and then rescinded his on-the-record comments, it was clear that Johnson was beginning to buckle under the pressure and wanted to talk. Cause of death, convenient heart attack. That nails it. And it is quite extraordinary to put it together that way, because Johnson, of course, in the end, as I said, he becomes basically the victim of his own, cooperation in that sense. And if, I showed those pictures of him with the long hair in the back and stuff and just looking completely out of it. And that mental deterioration that is on record by so many people who knew him, that's accountable for his actions of going along with the assassination of President Kennedy, taking over that national security structure, and then ramming through that hidden space program and the war in Vietnam and all the rest of it. Just tapped him right out.
Can you end with another shot of the glam rock picture? Is it around?
It's a good question. I've got von Braun with the banjo. Let's see. That much I do have.
There we go.
And finally, of course, it is... You're not going to beat this for a shot of our friend, Richard Byrd, Admiral Byrd, the king of Antarctica, as it were. Absolutely fascinating. Fantastic, everyone. Great to see you out there. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here real quick before we leave. LBJ is roasting on a spit right now. Let's see. Why does President Johnson allude to JFK conspiracy interviews when he may have been involved? I think this is exactly the question, isn't it? He's saying, just like when they brought up to him that, hey, Garrison is looking into this, and, on the record, in the background of the tape, he says to the guys, well, is he, he's saying it comes back to me. He sounds nervous that Garrison is going to uncover his own role in it. So he's ready to place the blame elsewhere, shall we say. But I don't think that LBJ, sort of he was in the command structure as the person who needed to be there, who would be the recipient of this great thing. And he certainly knew, let's say, what was going on. But I think it's the Central Intelligence Agency, that ex-protect aerospace defense contractor wing, that's involved there. And if you look at Farrell's material around those aerospace groups and their connection to the paperclip scientist. That gives you the track for the other space program. These things start to even out and make a lot more sense. Bird, Devo. There you go. LBJ had airport of his personal home, lots of gold stolen. Interesting. Yeah, I like that one. I think I remember something about, I was reading something about his airport. Wow. Zach Robinson, Sharon Baxter, James M., Frank Monday, interview professor. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Bird, Karen Carpenter. LBJ was kissing the ring. Why? I showed that picture. It's very important, I think, of him kissing the hand of Harry Byrd, who was in charge. And, it just so happens, I think, that this is one of those telling moments in history where you have a president kissing the hand of Byrd, who we owed so much to. But if you think about Byrd in relation to, all the incredible things that were going on, the fact that he was related to D.H. Byrd, and the fact that his brother had gone to Antarctica, obviously, if Harry Byrd was holding the strings as the senator from Virginia for NASA and LBJ was Senator NASA, then this relationship had gone back a good ways.
Is that it?
Yes, that is the picture. And I think in a way it's the real telling piece. This is just after LBJ assumes the presidency through the assassination of President Kennedy. Let's remember, too, that President Kennedy was moving the culture forward. He had gone to a level where he had taken us out of the threat of nuclear war, even though it was very, tense in Cuba, and anyone else, would have buckled under that. But President Kennedy basically saved the world in that exchange. And, the nature of his idea of keeping space as a science zone and for man's exploration, humanity's exploration, then that's a whole different thing than what the military industrial complex wanted to do with it and what they continue to do with it. So we have to think of President Kennedy in true heroic terms, and to think that these people who removed him, they did it because they didn't want the freedom vision that he represented. And they knew that he had the smarts, the intuition, and the mettle to make it all come to pass. So, this is why I think getting the truth out about President Kennedy is so important. But we understand here in our conversation and in our discussion in the ideas room, just how important that Kennedy presidency was, and the UFO sharing aspect at the end of his life, this piece coming into view, his opposition to the Federal Reserve and the intense militarism. It's a different world. It's a different world. And he was in a place to do something about it. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're going to wrap things up.
Okay, this was an incredible show.
Unbelievable. You did amazing. Oswald was just a patsy. That's true. That's what he said he was. I had notes, and I will share them next time, but I had some notes from the original interrogation of Oswald. And it's interesting because, after he said he got a Coke, he said he went down to the first floor to watch the parade. Isn't that interesting? When you think about the Billy Lovelady picture and you think about all these different things that they say about Oswald, well, he was up there, he shot the bullets, he ran down the stairs, but there were all these people on the stairs who didn't see him run by the stairs. And then he took off and he took a bus, and then he took a cab and all the rest of it. It's interesting. There's a story back there, if you find it, by Roger Craig. And he was the deputy sheriff who was there when the whole thing happened. And he saw a policeman going up the grassy knoll, and he was like, oh, I'll go follow this guy. And while he's doing it, he sees Oswald come out of the Texas School Book Depository and get into a Green Rambler. And, Ruth Payne, where Oswald's wife was staying, she had a car that was very similar to what Craig saw. And then later, when they have Oswald in and they're interrogating him, Craig looks at him. He says, that's the guy I saw get into the Green Rambler. So, there's a lot to look at there. Yes.
Are those interviews with Roger Craig still up on YouTube?
Yeah, you can find them. Mark Lane did a series of interviews with him in the 70s. I have excerpts of his interviews in my Agent Oswald documentary. You can start there. And then Mark Lane, I think it's called, it's JFK in Dallas is the name of it. But yes, very interesting. And I think Craig's testimony is spot on. And remember, Craig is the one who went into the depository within the first few minutes, and he went in with Seymour Weitzman. Those are the two policemen. He was a deputy sheriff, and Weitzman ran a sporting goods store, and he was a policeman. And they found a rifle on the 6th floor, and Weitzman, because he knew rifles from the sporting goods store, said, "Hey, look, it's a Mauser." And they both looked at it, it had a stamp of a Mauser on the bottom of the gun. So Oswald had a Mannlicher Carcano gun. So there's no way that this would have, this wouldn't have tracked back to Oswald at all. So they switched the gun at some point. And there's a lot there, I think, just with that piece alone. Oswald was naval intelligence. Yeah, I think Oswald was used by several intelligence outfits, but I think the core group that was calling the shots on Oswald was the Central Intelligence Agency. This is somebody who was also used by James Hosty, for gathering information. One of the things they had him do, which was really brilliant, and Professor Scott has this in his very interesting book, which holds up dramatically well, called Deep Politics and the JFK Assassination, that what they had Oswald doing was he was on a mission to track for the FBI how people were ordering weapons by the mail. And that's why he spoke to this Adrian Elba guy who was next door at Riley and ran out like a parking garage. And he talked to him all about how you order weapons through the mail. And what they had him do is they said, set up a P.O. box under a different name. And then they tracked the name with him. They made him an ID and all this stuff. And then he orders a gun through the mail from Chicago to come into this P.O. box. And then later they can say, hey, look, he ordered the rifle that he killed the president with, when in fact he's doing his job. And he's, going through the process of buying this mail order rifle to see how people get weapons through the mail. And of course, in Texas at the time, you can just walk into any store and buy a rifle. So there'd be no reason for him to order it through the mail. These are the types of links and the type of thinking that we need to really unravel that whole thing. And I think a lot of these researchers really did. I think the only thing that's underrepresented and can really open things up dramatically is the aerospace UFO file piece. That would blow the whole game out, because that's what the CIA is hiding on that. And with that, everyone, thank you so much. And hey, we got Joseph out there. Mm-hmm. And he says, I do not use YouTube anymore. Okay. Well, that's important to know. He can tell us why. Well, we'll get you on soon and you can tell us all why. But I've been meaning to talk to you in any case. It's great to see you out there. Yes, we'll have you on soon, sir. We need to catch up. I hope you had a great new year as well. Fantastic. Esther Taylor's out there. Mike Jones. Fantastic. Everyone, we will see you all next week. And that will be X-Series 143, opening up on this theme dramatically. We have some interesting Mystery School episodes coming up for you at the end of the month that I think you'll find very interesting. And we'll have Gigi Young coming on, and some very, Gigi's, the work that she's been doing. I don't know if you've gone to gigiyoung.com. It's very interesting work that she's doing, but on her YouTube channel, the Mars Mystery Series, going into those deeper levels on that. Definitely check it out. Absolutely cutting edge stuff. And I'm glad that everyone's doing such great work right now. This is a great start to the new year. And Miss Olivia, bravo, bravissimo. And as they say, and we'll also get Joseph on. I have actually the perfect show for Joseph coming up. And I will lay that on him soon. But it's great to have everyone here. We will see you all next week. And probably, it says end broadcast, but
Can we end on a joke?
Yeah, sure.
It's a pretty good joke.
Yeah.
Boober Fighter says J. Edgar Hoover would know a Mannlicher if he saw one.
Good Good old Hoover. He cross-dressed his way to fame. We will see. We will see you all next week, and have a great weekend, everybody. And remember, it's David Bowie's birthday tomorrow. It would have been his
And Elvis, right?
76th birthday. It's true. It's also Elvis's birthday. And I can only imagine that they both were really annoyed at that. You can just imagine. But anyway, break out the Diamond Dogs and make it happen. So we'll see you all next week, everyone. Maybe some special reports in between if some of the stuff breaks that I think is going to. But, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends. So,
God bless everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Miss Olivia. And we'll see you all next week.
Time for pancakes.